They say a woman scorned becomes a demon. They were wrong. Lady Seraphina Vale didn't become a demon the night she found her husband tangled in silk sheets with her own cousin. She became something far more terrifying. She became awake. Because in a world where power answers only to ruthlessness and loyalty is currency for fools, the greatest sin isn't betrayal. It's staying blind to it. What happened next wasn't revenge. It was education. And before this story ends, you'll understand why the most dangerous people aren't those born with power. They're the ones who had it stolen and learned to take it back with interest. DC. The winter air bit through the stone corridors of Blackthorn Manor like 1,000 small knives. Seraphina's slippers made no sound against the marble as she moved through the eastern wing, a silk shawl wrapped around her shoulders doing nothing against the cold that had nothing to do with temperature. It was past midnight. Adrian had said he was reviewing military reports in his study. He always said that on Thursday nights. For 3 years, she had believed him. The corridor stretched before her like a tunnel into some darker version of her life, lit only by the occasional oil lamp casting shadows that seemed to reach for her dress. She'd walked these halls 1,000 times as the dutiful Duchess, the gentle wife who organized charity galas and smiled at political dinners and never, ever asked questions that might embarrass her husband. That woman felt like a stranger now, a ghost haunting her own body. She reached the door to Adrian's private chamber, not his study, but the room he kept locked, the one he claimed was for storing old family documents. Her hand trembled as it touched the brass handle. Some part of her still wanted to turn back, to return to her own quarters and pretend tomorrow that she hadn't heard the servants whispering, that she hadn't noticed the scent of perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his jacket, that she hadn't seen Evelyn, her own cousin, leaving this wing 3 times in the past month. But that was the old Seraphina, the one who chose comfort over truth. She pushed the door open. The scene burned itself into her retinas like staring directly at the sun. Adrian's bare back. Evelyn's red hair spilled across pillows that Seraphina had embroidered herself as a wedding gift. The sound of their laughter cutting off mid-breath. The way they didn't immediately scramble apart, but instead froze, as if they'd been caught doing something mildly inappropriate rather than destroying the foundation of her entire existence. Adrian turned his head slowly. No shame in his eyes. Just irritation. "You weren't supposed to be here," his expression said. "You weren't supposed to see." Seraphina stood in the doorway, her world tilting on an axis she hadn't known could move. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Not a scream, not even a whisper. Just silence so complete it swallowed everything. Evelyn pulled a sheet around herself, her face flushed, but not from embarrassment, from annoyance. "Sarah, I can explain." "Don't!" Adrian's voice cut across the room like a blade. He stood, reaching for a robe with the casual entitlement of a man who'd never feared consequences. "This doesn't concern you right now." "Doesn't concern me." The words hung in the air like smoke. Seraphina felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture spreading through everything she'd built her identity upon. She'd loved this man, shaped herself into what he needed, smiled when he dismissed her opinions at state dinners, accepted that his work was more important than spending time together, believed that marriage was partnership and partnership meant sacrifice. "How long?" Her voice came out steady, too steady, the calm before something catastrophic. Adrian tied his robe, his jaw tight. "Seraphina, go back to your room. We'll discuss this in the morning when you're not hysterical." Hysterical? She wanted to laugh. She'd never been hysterical in her life. That was her problem, wasn't it? All that careful composure, all that swallowed rage, all those times she'd chosen peace over dignity because good wives didn't make scenes. "How long, Adrian?" He sighed like she was a child refusing bedtime. 5 years. "Are you satisfied now?" 5 years. Before the wedding. During the engagement. While she'd been planning their ceremony, choosing flowers that matched his family colors, memorizing the names of every noble in the duchy so she wouldn't embarrass him at their first ball as husband and wife. While she'd been building a life, he'd been, "She's better suited to you." Evelyn's voice was almost gentle, the way you'd speak to someone terminally ill. "You married for politics, Sarah. You had to know it wasn't real." Real. Seraphina looked at her cousin, beautiful, confident Evelyn who'd grown up in the same household, who'd shared secrets and childhood dreams, who'd promised to always be her sister in spirit since they'd never be sisters in blood. Real. Adrian moved toward the door, toward Serafina, his hand outstretched as if to guide her out. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Our marriage serves a purpose. It secured the trade agreements with the Vale family. It gave me connections to the eastern provinces. That doesn't change. And what do I get? The question escaped before she could cage it. He frowned as if she'd asked something nonsensical. Protection, status, the Blackthorn name. What more could you want? What more could she want? Serafina stared at this man she'd promised forever to and realized she didn't know him at all. Perhaps she never had. She'd loved a fantasy, a projection, a role he'd played just well enough to get what he needed. She turned to leave. There's a royal summons coming. Adrian's voice stopped her at the threshold. The king wants me to formalize ties with the Montrose family through Eveline. Once that alliance is set, we'll discuss ending our marriage quietly. You'll be taken care of, naturally. A small estate, a pension. Taken care of. Like a retired horse. Serafina's fingers tightened on the doorframe until her knuckles went white. Behind her, she heard Evelyn whisper something that might have been, "I'm sorry," but the words held no weight, no substance. They were just sounds people made when they wanted absolution without change. She walked back to her quarters in a daze, her mind curiously blank. The servants she passed kept their eyes down, which meant they knew. Of course they knew. Everyone probably knew except the fool who'd been too trusting to see. Her chambers felt like a mausoleum, everything perfectly arranged. The vanity with its silver brushes, the wardrobe full of dresses in blackthorn blue, the escritoire where she wrote letters to charitable organizations begging for donations to feed the poor while living in a palace built on lies. Serafina sat at her writing desk and stared at her hands. They didn't look like her hands anymore. They looked like weapons she hadn't learned to use yet. A soft knock at the door. Her lady's maid, Catherine, entered with a tea tray, her face carefully neutral. "I thought you might need something warm, my lady." Serafina said nothing. Catherine set the tray down and hesitated, and in that hesitation, Serafina heard an entire conversation they weren't having. "Did you know?" "Of course you knew. How many others knew?" "Will there be anything else, my lady?" "How long have the staff been aware?" Serafina's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Catherine's hands twisted in her apron. My lady, it isn't my place." "How long, Catherine?" The maid's shoulders slumped. "Since the beginning, my lady. I'm sorry. Everyone thought you knew and had accepted it. Noble marriages are often arrangements." Arrangements. What a clean word for such filth. "Thank you, Catherine. You may go." The maid fled. Serafina sat alone in the silence, and that's when she heard them. Voices carrying through the ventilation grates that connected the upper rooms. A design flaw she'd once thought charming because it meant she could hear the garden fountains from her chambers. Now she heard Adrian and someone else. A man's voice she recognized as Lord Marcus Voren, the king's chief advisor. She moved to the grate and listened. "Necessary to move quickly," Voren was saying. "The Montrose alliance will secure the southern ports, but only if you can marry Evelyn before the Vale family realizes they've been used." Adrian's laugh. "Serafina won't cause problems. She's too soft, too desperate to keep the peace." "You're certain? A scorned wife can be dangerous." "Serafina!" Adrian's voice dripped with condescension. "The woman who apologizes when servants bump into her, who cries over wounded animals. She'll sign whatever papers I put in front of her and retire to some country estate to paint watercolors. Trust me, the gentle ones never fight back." Voren's voice dropped lower. "And the other matter? The documents she has access to as Duchess? She doesn't understand politics well enough to know what's valuable, but I've already begun transferring sensitive materials to more secure locations. By the time the marriage ends, she'll have nothing that could damage us." "Good. The king wants this transition clean. No scandals, no messy divorces that might raise questions about the Blackthorn family's operations. We've worked too hard building this network of alliances." "What network? Trade agreements, military contracts, the private prisons in the Northern Territories? The crown profits from your family's enterprises, Blackthorn. That's why this marriage to Evelyn matters. She's politically astute enough to manage the public face while you handle the less visible aspects of power." The conversation drifted to other topics. Serafina remained at the grate until long after the voices faded, her mind no longer blank but crystallizing into something new, something sharp and cold and purposeful. They thought she was weak, too gentle to fight, too naive to understand what they'd built on her family's name and money. For the first time in her life, Serafina smiled and meant it as a threat. Morning came with artificial brightness. Serafina rose before dawn, dressed herself without calling for Catherine, and spent an hour staring at her reflection in the mirror. Same face, same delicate features that people called beautiful in that dismissive way that meant ornamental but not formidable. Same soft brown eyes that Adrian had once claimed made him weak. Lies. All of it lies. But lies were tools, weren't they? And she'd been too honest to see their value. She descended to breakfast at the usual hour, her posture perfect, her dress a pale morning blue that made her look angelic. Adrian was already at the table, reading correspondence, not looking up when she entered. As if last night had been a minor inconvenience, as if breaking your wife's heart was equivalent to spilling wine on a tablecloth. "Good morning, Adrian." He glanced up, surprised by her steady tone. "Serafina, I trust you've had time to reflect." "I have. And you understand that our arrangement—" "I understand perfectly." She sat across from him, accepted tea from a footman, added sugar with hands that didn't shake. "You need me to be compliant while you transition to a more advantageous marriage. In exchange, I'll receive a pension and a quiet retirement." Adrian studied her face, looking for signs of hysteria that weren't there. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. Many women would make it difficult." "I'm not many women." "No." He almost smiled. "You're not. That's why this can be civilized." Civilized. She sipped her tea and tasted copper. She'd bitten her tongue without realizing it. "When will the arrangements be formalized?" "Within the month. The king wants to announce the Montrose alliance at the spring gala. You'll remain Duchess until then, of course. For appearances." For appearances. She was a costume he'd put on and would discard when fashion changed. "I'll need access to my family's financial records," Serafina said, "to ensure my pension is properly structured." Adrian waved a hand dismissively. "That's not necessary. My steward will handle everything." "I insist. Surely after 3 years of marriage, I'm entitled to understand what happens to the Vale holdings that were merged with Blackthorn assets." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Why this sudden interest in finances?" "Because, unlike you, I don't assume people will simply give me what I deserve." She smiled over her teacup. "I learned that last night." The barb landed. Adrian set down his correspondence with more force than necessary. "Fine. I'll have the steward prepare summaries. But don't interfere with estate management, Serafina. You've never understood business." "Then it's time I learned." She left him at the table, moved through the manor with purpose, and went directly to the estate library. 3 years she'd lived here. 3 years she'd been told the financial records were too complicated, too boring, not suitable for a lady's concern. 3 years she'd believed that nonsense because good wives didn't question their husbands. The library was a cathedral of knowledge 2 stories tall, lined with books Adrian had inherited but never read. Serafina pulled volume after volume on trade law, military contracts, noble succession rights. She spread documents across reading tables. She took notes in margins. She began to understand the architecture of the system that had used her. Hours passed. The sun climbed and fell. Catherine brought meals Serafina barely touched. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture emerged that made her earlier heartbreak seem quaint. The Blackthorn family wasn't just politically influential. They were criminals operating under aristocratic cover. The private prisons Voren had mentioned weren't correctional facilities, but slave labor camps where political dissidents were worked to death. The trade agreements weren't legitimate commerce, but smuggling operations for weapons and contraband. And the Vale family money that Serafina had brought to the marriage? Laundered through false investments to fund operations that would be treason if exposed. Her family had been robbed, and she'd helped them do it by being too naive to ask questions. "My lady?" Catherine stood in the library doorway, her face worried. "It's past midnight. You should rest." Serafina looked up from a ledger detailing payments to an assassination guild. "Tell me something, Catherine. When did you realize I was a fool?" The maid's eyes widened. "My lady, I never—" "I'm not angry with you. I want to know when." When did you see that I was playing a role in a script everyone else had already read? Catherine twisted her apron again, that nervous gesture Seraphina now recognized as guilt. From the beginning, my lady. But we thought... She stopped. You thought I knew and didn't care, that I'd married for status and accepted infidelity as the price. Seraphina closed the ledger gently. What you didn't realize is that I actually loved him. Pathetic, isn't it? No, my lady, it's human. Human. What a kind word for such weakness. Thank you, Catherine. Get some sleep. The maid left. Seraphina remained in the library until dawn, reading by lamplight, taking notes in a cipher she invented on the spot, committing to memory every dirty secret Adrian's family had accumulated. By the time the sun rose, she knew 3 things with absolute certainty. First, the Blackthorne family couldn't survive if their criminal operations were exposed. Second, she had enough evidence to destroy them completely. Third, revenge wasn't enough. She was going to dismantle the entire corrupt system they'd built, piece by piece, and make them watch. Duchess. The transformation began so subtly that no one noticed at first. Seraphina continued her daily routines, managing the household staff, attending charity functions, playing the role of the gracious Duchess. But underneath the performance, she was weaponizing everything they'd taught her to be. Her gentleness became a tool to make people underestimate her. Her charity work became a network for gathering information from servants and commoners who saw everything nobles ignored. Her social connections became intelligence pipelines. Every tea party was reconnaissance. Every dinner party was psychological warfare. She started with small tests. Casual questions at gatherings about various noble families, gauging who was loyal to whom. Innocent requests to visit Adrian's study to retrieve a book, noting which documents he left visible and which he locked away. Friendly conversations with visiting dignitaries' servants, learning the gossip that nobles paid informants fortunes to discover. Within 2 weeks, she'd mapped the entire power structure of the kingdom's upper class. Who was sleeping with whom, who was drowning in debt, who was secretly backing which political faction. And more importantly, she'd identified who had secrets that could be leveraged. Lord Marcus Voren, the king's trusted advisor who'd spoken so casually about criminal enterprises? He had a bastard son he'd hidden for 16 years, paid for by embezzled crown funds. Duke Aldrich Montrose, whose family Adrian was so eager to ally with. Deeply in debt from gambling losses, about to lose his ancestral estate unless he secured financial backing through marriage. Evelyn herself? Not the political mastermind, Adrian thought, but a pawn who'd been promised queenship in exchange for seducing Adrian away from Seraphina. She'd been used just as thoroughly, just too ambitious to see it. The information accumulated like kindling around a pyre. Seraphina just needed the right spark. It came 3 weeks after the night of betrayal. Adrian summoned her to his study with unusual formality. "We need to discuss the terms of our separation," he said without preamble. "The king has approved the Montrose alliance. The announcement will be made in 2 weeks at the spring gala." "I see." Seraphina sat across from him, her hands folded demurely in her lap. "And what terms are you proposing?" He slid a document across the desk. "A quiet annulment on grounds of incompatibility. You'll receive Greyhaven Manor and an annual income of 5,000 crowns. In exchange, you'll relinquish all claims to Blackthorne assets and agree to never speak publicly about our marriage." 5,000 crowns. Her family had brought 10 times that in dowry alone. "And if I refuse?" Adrian's smile was cold. "Then I'll petition for annulment on grounds of your failure to produce an heir. It's less generous and more humiliating, but the result will be the same. You have no power here, Seraphina. Accept what I'm offering." She read the document slowly, noting every clause designed to strip her of dignity and resources. The old Seraphina would have signed, would have been grateful for even this much, but that woman was dead. "I'll need time to consider," she said. "You have until the gala. After that, the choice is made for you." She left his study and went directly to her chambers, where she'd been hiding correspondence under a loose floorboard. Letters from people Adrian had wronged. Testimonies from families destroyed by Blackthorne schemes. Financial records she'd copied during late-night trips to the estate offices. And one name she'd been saving for the right moment, Crown Prince Lucian Ashford. The prince was a problem for the Blackthorne family. Too intelligent to manipulate. Too principled to bribe. Too paranoid to trust easily. Adrian had spent years trying to neutralize him politically, but Lucien remained stubbornly incorruptible, investigating corruption in the military and noble families with the focus of a man on a crusade, which meant he was exactly the ally Serafina needed. She penned a letter in her best hand, addressed it to the Crown Prince, and paid a courier she'd carefully vetted to deliver it personally. The message was simple. Your Highness, I possess evidence of treason within the Blackthorn family that will interest you. If you wish to discuss this matter privately, meet me at the Rose Garden of Harrington Estate tomorrow at noon. I understand you value discretion as much as I value survival. Lady Serafina Vale. Not Blackthorn. Vale. That was intentional. She sent the letter and waited. The next day arrived cold and clear. Serafina dressed in a riding habit of deep green, practical, not ornamental, and rode to Harrington Estate, an old property abandoned after its noble family died out in a plague 20 years prior. The rose garden was overgrown now, wild roses climbing over stone walls, but it was private and far enough from Blackthorn Manor that no one would question her absence. She waited among the thorns and wondered if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Crown princes didn't meet with desperate wives. This was either the beginning of her revenge or the moment she discovered how powerless she truly was. Then she heard footsteps. Prince Lucien Ashford appeared through the garden entrance alone, which was either brave or foolish. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sharp features and eyes that assessed her like she was a puzzle to solve. He wore simple traveling clothes rather than royal regalia, which suggested he'd taken her request for discretion seriously. Lady Serafina, he inclined his head slightly, you have 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't report this meeting to your husband. Straight to business. She appreciated that. Because you've been investigating the Blackthorn family for 3 years and gotten nowhere. I can give you everything you need to destroy them. His expression didn't change. And why would you do that? Because they're going to discard me like trash, and I'd rather burn their house down than watch them prosper. Now he smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. Scorned wife syndrome. How cliché. Scorned wife with access to 3 years of financial records, private correspondence, and a functioning memory of every criminal conversation I overheard while playing the ignorant Duchess. Not so cliché. She pulled a folded document from her writing jacket. This is a ledger showing payments to the Crimson Blade Assassination Guild for the murders of 7 political rivals. I have 40 more documents like it hidden where Adrian will never find them. Lucien took the ledger, his eyes scanning the pages with the speed of someone who knew exactly what he was reading. His jaw tightened. Where did you get this? The estate library. Turns out when you convince your wife she's too stupid to understand business, she has free access to incriminating evidence. Serafina watched his face. You've been trying to prove Blackthorn corruption for years. I'm handing you proof. What's it worth to you? That depends on what you want in return. I want them destroyed, completely. Adrian, Evelyn, Voren, every noble family profiting from their schemes. I want the kingdom to know what they've been doing, and I want immunity from prosecution for anything my name might have been attached to without my knowledge. Lucien studied her for a long moment. You understand that if you do this, your life as you know it ends. You'll be called a traitor by half the nobility. The Blackthorn family will try to kill you. There's no going back. There's no going back anyway. They already wrote my ending. It just involved me disappearing quietly. I'm choosing a different story. The prince smiled again, and this time there was something almost like respect in it. You're either very brave or very stupid. I'm very tired of being powerless. Is there a difference? He laughed, a short, sharp sound. No, I don't suppose there is. He folded the ledger and tucked it inside his jacket. All right, Lady Serafina, let's burn it all down. They met 3 more times over the next week, always in secret, always in different locations. Lucien brought his own intelligence network, spies embedded in noble households, reformed criminals he'd turned into informants, military officers loyal to the crown rather than corrupt dukes. Serafina brought documentation and insider knowledge that turned suspicions into prosecutable offenses. Together they built a case that would shake the kingdom's foundations, but the work took its toll. Serafina found herself sleeping less, eating mechanically, consumed by the intricate web of destruction she was weaving. Catherine noticed and said nothing, which was its own form of loyalty. Adrian noticed and assumed she was depressed about the impending annulment, which was perfect. The spring gala approached like a thunderstorm on the horizon. Adrian moved through the manor with the confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. Eveline visited more openly now, no longer bothering to hide her status as the future Duchess. They were planning their wedding, discussing guest lists and floral arrangements, while Serafina was still technically married to him. The cruelty was intentional. They wanted her to know she was disposable. What they didn't know was that every conversation they had in the manor, Serafina was recording through a network of servant informants she'd carefully cultivated. Every casual admission of wrongdoing, every offhand comment about illegal activities, every laugh at her expense, all of it documented, dated, prepared for the moment when the trap would spring. 3 days before the gala, Adrian made his final mistake. He hosted a private meeting in his study with Voren, Duke Montrose, and 2 other corrupt nobles. Serafina listened through the ventilation grate as they discussed their plans in detail. Not just the marriage alliance, but the expansion of their criminal operations, the assassinations they had planned for reformist politicians, the bribes they'd pay to crown officials. They felt so safe, so untouchable. Lucien, listening to Serafina's recording later in the abandoned rose garden, shook his head in disbelief. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. This is treason on a scale that could justify executions. Will it be enough? Serafina asked. More than enough. We expose this at the gala, and it's over. The king will have no choice but to act. He looked at her seriously. But once we do this, there's no protection I can offer you during the immediate fallout. Adrian will know you're responsible. He'll come for you. Let him try. The prince smiled that sharp smile again. You've changed, Lady Serafina. I'm not sure if that's tragic or inspiring. Both, probably. They finalized the plan. The spring gala would be attended by every important noble in the kingdom, including the king himself. Lucien would arrange for crown investigators to be stationed nearby. And during the formal announcement of the Montrose-Blackthorn alliance, Serafina would present her evidence before the assembled court. It was theatrical, dangerous, possibly suicidal. It was perfect. Shamanich. The night before the gala, Serafina stood in her chambers surrounded by 3 years of accumulated evidence. Documents stacked on every surface. Ledgers, letters, testimonies, recordings. The dismantled life of a criminal empire hidden in the bedroom of the woman they had dismissed as irrelevant. Catherine knocked softly. My lady, you should rest. Tomorrow will be difficult. Tomorrow will be everything. Serafina touched a stack of papers detailing embezzlement from crown coffers. Catherine, after tomorrow I won't be a duchess anymore. I probably won't be welcome in polite society. You don't have to stay with me. The maid moved to stand beside her. With respect, my lady, I've served you for 3 years. You never once treated us as lesser. You learned our names, our families, our problems. When my sister was sick, you paid for her medicine and never mentioned it again. She gestured at the evidence. Half the staff has been feeding you information, not because you asked, but because you earned loyalty while Lord Adrian assumed servants were furniture. Where you go, several of us will follow. Serafina felt something crack in her chest. Not heartbreak this time, but something softer. Gratitude, maybe. Or recognition that she'd built something real while everything else was falling apart. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, my lady, for showing us that gentle doesn't mean weak. That night, Serafina didn't sleep. She sat by her window watching the stars and thinking about the woman she'd been 3 weeks ago. That soft-voiced girl who'd believed in love and loyalty and the inherent goodness of people, who'd shaped herself into a perfect wife, a dutiful duchess, an ornament for a man who viewed her as property. She mourned that girl, not because she'd been wrong to trust, but because the world had punished her for it. Tomorrow, she'd show them what happened when you created a monster by destroying a human being. What? The spring gala was everything the nobility did well. Excessive, beautiful, and hollow. The royal palace ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and silk banners. Nobles in formal dress moved through choreographed dances, while musicians played and servants circulated with champagne and lies. Serafina arrived alone, dressed in a gown of crimson silk that made her look like a wound. People noticed. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The gentle duchess wearing such a bold color, was it defiance or ignorance of her impending social death? Adrian saw her across the ballroom and frowned but didn't approach. Evelyn, radiant in blackthorn blue, ignored her completely. They were preparing for their moment of triumph, the announcement that would cement their alliance and cast Serafina into obscurity. But Crown Prince Lucian noticed. He stood near the king's throne, his expression neutral, but when their eyes met across the crowd, he gave the smallest nod. The king rose to speak. The ballroom fell silent. Lords and ladies, thank you for attending this celebration of spring and renewal. Tonight we announce an alliance that will strengthen our kingdom's future. The formal union of House Blackthorn and House Montrose through the marriage of Duke Adrian Blackthorn to Lady Evelyn Montrose. Applause. Adrian and Evelyn moved to the center of the ballroom, their smiles perfect. However, the king paused, consulting a paper an aide had just handed him. His expression darkened. It has come to my attention that certain irregularities require investigation before any formal alliance can proceed. Prince Lucian, would you present your findings? The ballroom erupted in confused murmurs. Adrian's smile faltered. Lucian stepped forward, and behind him came palace guards and royal investigators carrying boxes of documents. Your Majesty, honored guests, over the past 3 years, I've been investigating allegations of corruption within our noble ranks. Tonight, I present conclusive evidence of treason, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder, all orchestrated by Duke Adrian Blackthorn and his co-conspirators. The whispers became a roar. Adrian turned pale. This is outrageous. Who dares? I dare. Serafina's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She stepped forward, and the crowd parted before her. I, Lady Serafina Vale, formerly known as Duchess Blackthorn, present evidence of 3 years of criminal activity conducted under the protection of my family's name and fortune. Adrian stared at her as if she'd become something inhuman. Serafina, what are you— Shut up! The command came out so cold that he actually stepped back. You wanted me silent, compliant, grateful for the scraps you threw me. But you made a mistake, Adrian. You assumed I was weak because I was kind. You confused mercy with cowardice. She turned to address the assembled court, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. For 3 years, I played the role of the ignorant wife. I smiled while my husband betrayed me with my own cousin. I stayed silent while the Blackthorn family used my dowry to fund assassination plots. I accepted humiliation because I believed that's what good wives did. The ballroom was absolutely silent now. Even the musicians had stopped playing. But last month I learned that this marriage was never real, that I was nothing but a political tool to be discarded when more useful alliances emerged. So I stopped being the person they wanted me to be and became the person they should have feared. She nodded to Lucian, who began distributing documents to the king and assembled nobles. These ledgers detail payments to criminal organizations for political murders. These letters prove coordination between Duke Blackthorn and Lord Voren to embezzle crown funds. These testimonies come from families destroyed by illegal land seizures and fraudulent debt schemes. And these recordings— She produced a strange mechanical device that played back Adrian's own voice, discussing their criminal operations. Prove that the Arat extends all the way to the Royal Advisory Council. Adrian lunged toward her, but palace guards intercepted him. You traitorous bitch! You've destroyed everything. No, Serafina said calmly. You destroyed everything. I just made sure everyone could see. Evelyn, realizing the disaster unfolding, tried to distance herself. I didn't know about the criminal activities. I was only— You knew. Serafina turned her gaze on her cousin, and for the first time in her life she let her hatred show completely. You seduced my husband knowing he was married. You planned to take my place knowing it would destroy me. You benefited from every scheme because you were promised a crown once I was eliminated. You're not a victim, Evelyn. You're an accomplice. The king stood, his face thunderous. Duke Blackthorn, you are hereby stripped of your title pending trial for treason. Lord Voren, Duke Montrose, you are under arrest. Guards, take them. Chaos erupted. Adrian fought against the guards holding him, his composure completely shattered. This is insane. She's lying. She's a scorned woman twisting facts. These facts have witnesses, Lucian said coldly, including palace officials you bribed, military officers you blackmailed, and the assassins you hired who are now cooperating with the crown in exchange for reduced sentences. Lady Serafina didn't twist anything. She simply revealed who you've always been. Adrian's eyes found Seraphina's across the ballroom, and what she saw there was pure hatred mixed with disbelief. He genuinely never thought she was capable of this. Even now, even with his world collapsing, part of him couldn't comprehend that the gentle Duchess had weaponized her gentleness into his destruction. "I loved you," he said, and it sounded like an accusation. Seraphina smiled, that new smile that was all edges and no warmth. "No, you loved what I could give you. There's a difference." As guards dragged him away, Adrian screamed threats and promises of revenge that echoed through the ballroom long after he disappeared. Evelyn went quietly, tears streaming down her face, but whether they were for herself or for what she'd lost, Seraphina didn't care enough to wonder. The king addressed the stunned assembly. "This investigation will proceed with full transparency. Any noble families found to have participated in these schemes will face justice accordingly. The crown does not protect traitors, regardless of bloodline." Nobles who'd been friendly with the Blackthorn family suddenly discovered pressing business elsewhere. Within minutes, the ballroom had divided into those seeking distance from the scandal and those hungry for details. Seraphina stood at the center of it all, alone, except for Catherine standing quietly behind her, and felt nothing except exhaustion. Lucien approached. "You should leave before the vultures descend. This will be the scandal of the decade. Everyone will want a piece of you." "Let them want." But he was right. Seraphina left through a side entrance, Catherine following, and didn't look back at the glittering ballroom that had just witnessed the death of everything she'd once believed in. Outside, the night air was cold and clear. Carriages were arriving to collect nobles eager to spread gossip. Seraphina breathed deeply and felt, for the first time in weeks, like she could actually fill her lungs. "My lady?" Catherine's voice was tentative. "What happens now?" Seraphina looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched her cry 3 weeks ago, that had witnessed her transformation from victim to architect of destruction. Now? Now we see how far I'm willing to go. Because exposing Adrian was just the beginning. The evidence she'd gathered implicated dozens of noble families. The criminal networks extended beyond Blackthorn into the military, the church, the royal court itself. She'd opened a door to darkness that couldn't be closed. And somewhere in the palace behind her, documents were being reviewed that would reveal exactly how corrupt the kingdom had become. They'd expect her to fade into the background now that her revenge was complete. But they'd learned nothing from watching Adrian burn. Underestimation was a luxury she'd never grant again. Seraphina climbed into her carriage with Catherine and looked back at the palace one last time. Somewhere in there, Adrian was likely in a cell, perhaps still unable to believe that the woman he'd discarded had dismantled his entire world. The carriage pulled away. Seraphina closed her eyes and thought about what came next. Because this story, her story, wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rebuilding, about taking the power they'd concentrated in corrupt hands and redistributing it to people who'd been ground under aristocratic boots for generations. It was about becoming the monster they'd created and making them regret every lesson they'd taught her. It was about a crossbow bolt shattered the carriage window and buried itself in the seat where her head had been a second before. Catherine screamed. The driver shouted. The horses panicked, and the carriage lurched violently. Seraphina grabbed Catherine and threw them both to the floor as another bolt punched through the roof. Assassins. Adrian's or someone else's. Did it matter? She'd made enemies of the entire corrupt nobility tonight. The carriage door flew open. A figure in black reached inside, grabbed for her, and Seraphina did something she'd never done in her life. She drove a hat pin through his eye. The assassin screamed and fell backward. Catherine stared at her in shock. Seraphina's hand was covered in blood that looked black in the moonlight, and she felt nothing except cold calculation. "Drive," she screamed at the coachman. "Drive, or we die here." The carriage lurched forward. Behind them, more figures in black gave chase. Seraphina looked at Catherine's terrified face and realized with perfect clarity that this was never going to end. She'd declared war on the kingdom's power structure. They would hunt her until she was dead, or they were. The gentle Duchess was truly dead now. What remained was something new, something forged in betrayal and tempered in blood. And as the carriage raced through dark streets with assassins in pursuit, Seraphina made a choice that would define everything that followed. She wasn't running away. She was running toward the only person who might help her survive what came next, and that meant making a deal with the crown prince that would change both their futures forever. Because if they wanted a villain, she'd give them a legend. The carriage wheels screamed against cobblestone as they careened through narrow streets, assassins close enough that Serafina could hear their boots pounding behind them. Her hand still dripped with blood from the hatpin kill, her first kill, and the wet warmth of it felt less horrifying than it should have. That was the thought that cut deeper than fear. She'd just driven metal through a man's eye socket, and all she felt was the cold arithmetic of survival. Catherine pressed against the opposite seat, eyes wide with terror that Serafina recognized from mirrors she'd stopped looking into. The girl who would have apologized for existing was watching her former self die in real time. Another bolt punched through the carriage wall near Catherine's head. The maid didn't scream this time, just flinched and kept her eyes locked on Serafina, as if waiting for instructions on how to stay alive. That faith was a responsibility Serafina hadn't asked for, but couldn't afford to betray. She leaned forward and shouted at the driver through the small window. "The Eastern District, Crown Prince Lucien's private residence. You know it?" "My lady, that's... You want your family to collect your body from this street, or do you want to drive?" The whip cracked. The horses surged forward with renewed panic. Behind them, the assassins were falling back, but not abandoning pursuit. They knew where she was going now. Everyone would know. Running to the Crown Prince for protection was the same as declaring herself his ally, his asset, his problem. Good. She was done being anyone's victim. The Eastern District rose before them, less ostentatious than the palace quarter, but infinitely more secure. Military checkpoints, guard patrols, streets too well lit for ambushes. The assassins peeled away as the carriage crossed into royal territory, vanishing like roaches when the light comes on. Serafina let herself breathe. Catherine was crying silently, that particular kind of weeping where you're too scared to make noise. The girl had signed up to serve a duchess, not dodge crossbow bolts in midnight chases. Another casualty of Serafina's war. "We're alive," Serafina said, and heard how hollow it sounded. Alive wasn't the same as safe. Would never be safe again. The carriage stopped before a manor house that looked more like a fortress. High walls, iron gates, guards in royal livery stationed at every entrance. Before Serafina could announce herself, the gates swung open. They'd been expected. Of course they had. Lucien was always 3 moves ahead. That was why they needed each other. A steward met them at the entrance, his expression carefully neutral despite the blood on Serafina's gown and the bolt holes in her carriage. "Lady Serafina, His Highness anticipated you might require sanctuary. Please, come inside." Inside meant marble halls lit by oil lamps that cast shadows sharp enough to cut on. Catherine followed close enough to be a second shadow, her breathing still unsteady. Servants appeared to take their cloaks, but Serafina waved them off. She wanted her hands free, wanted to feel the space around her body where threats might emerge. Lucien waited in what might have been called a study, if studies typically featured weapons mounted on walls alongside books. He'd changed from his formal gala attire into something simpler, dark trousers, white shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows, the casual dress of someone preparing for work rather than performance. He looked at the blood on her hands and didn't ask if she was hurt. "How many?" "4 that I saw. 1 won't be seen anymore." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite approval, not quite amusement. "You killed an assassin with a hatpin." "I didn't have a sword." Most women would have frozen. Most women haven't spent the last month learning that everything they believed was a performance designed to keep them compliant. Serafina moved to a chair without being invited and sat like she belonged there, because the alternative was collapsing, and she refused to give weakness that much real estate. "Adrian sent them." "Unlikely. He's in a cell being interrogated. More probably one of his allies trying to silence you before you implicate them further." Catherine made a small sound of distress. Serafina glanced back at her maid, taking in the girl's pallor, the tremor in her hands. "Catherine, go with the steward. Get cleaned up, get food. You're safe here." "My lady, I need you functional, not traumatized into uselessness. Go." It came out harsher than intended, but Catherine seemed to understand it for what it was. Permission to fall apart somewhere private. She left with the steward, and Serafina found herself alone with the Crown Prince in a room full of weapons and books, an appropriate setting for whatever came next. Lucien poured 2 glasses of something amber and offered her one. You're handling this remarkably well for someone who just experienced her first assassination attempt. I'm not handling it. I'm postponing the breakdown until it won't get me killed. She took the glass but didn't drink. Couldn't afford the blur right now. They'll keep trying. Yes. You've made yourself a very expensive target. He sat across from her, studying her face with the intensity of someone evaluating an investment. Which brings us to the question of what happens next. You exposed a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of the nobility. You've created power vacuum, and those are never filled peacefully. People will want you dead, discredited, or controlled. Which category do you fall into? None. I want you useful. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You have intelligence, evidence, and most importantly, you have nothing left to lose. That makes you dangerous in ways the nobility isn't prepared for. They're used to dealing with players who care about reputation, legacy, social standing. You burned all that tonight. So what are you proposing? An alliance. You continue feeding me information on corrupt nobles. I provide protection, resources, and political backing. Together we dismantle the system that produced people like Adrian. Serafina laughed, sharp and humorless. You want to use me the same way Adrian did, as a tool that serves your purposes. No. Adrian wanted you silent and ornamental. I want you loud and dangerous. There's a difference. Lucian's expression didn't change, but something in his voice hardened. I've spent 5 years investigating corruption in this kingdom and getting blocked at every turn because the rot is so deep that pulling one thread unravels everything. You just proved it's possible to force accountability. But you can't do it alone, and I can't do it without someone who understands how these families operate from the inside. What makes you think I want to keep fighting? I destroyed Adrian. That was the point. Was it? He tilted his head. Because from where I'm sitting, you didn't just want revenge on one man. You wanted to prove that the system that enabled him could be broken. Otherwise, you would have taken your evidence to a magistrate quietly, instead of staging a public execution at the kingdom's most visible event. The observation landed like a knife between ribs. He was right, and she hated how easily he'd seen it. The exposure at the gala hadn't been about Adrian. It had been about showing every noble who'd ever dismissed her that gentleness wasn't weakness, that compliance was a choice, and that the rules only worked if everyone agreed to play by them. She'd stopped playing. What exactly would this alliance entail? Lucian set down his glass. You move into a secure residence under royal protection. Publicly, you're a witness in the treason investigation. Privately, you work with my intelligence network to identify and document corruption throughout the nobility. When we have enough evidence, we move against them systematically. And when your father, the king, decides I'm more trouble than I'm worth, my father doesn't decide my operations. I have autonomy in matters of crown security. It's one of the few advantages of being the spare prince who everyone expects to die in some military campaign. He said it without emotion, stating fact. But you're right to be suspicious. I'm offering you power in exchange for making you a target. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept. Brave. What a strange word for what she was considering. Brave implied choice made from strength. What she felt was more like momentum, falling forward because standing still meant getting crushed. But maybe that was what bravery looked like from the inside. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it paralyze you. I want full access to your intelligence network, Serafina said. Not just the information you think I need, everything. And I want veto power over targets. If you're going after a noble family, I need to approve the timing and method. That's asking for equal partnership. Yes, it is. Lucian studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand. Done. Welcome to the most dangerous job in the kingdom, Lady Serafina. She shook his hand and felt the calluses on his palm. This was a prince who trained with weapons, who understood violence as more than theoretical. Good. She'd need someone who wouldn't flinch when the work got bloody. One more thing, she added. I want my family's assets returned, everything Adrian stole through the marriage contract. My dowry, the Vale properties, the trade agreements, all of it. That's going to be complicated. Those assets are tied up in the Blackthorn estate, which is about to be seized by the crown for treason. I want my share before it gets divided among the treasury and your father's allies. She met his eyes. I'm not doing this for free, Your Highness. I need resources to rebuild, to protect the people who helped me, to create something that lasts beyond revenge. He smiled that sharp smile. You're negotiating like someone who knows her worth. I respect that. I'll make it happen. They shook again, and this time it felt like sealing a pact that would reshape the kingdom or destroy them both. Possibly both. Amats. The residence Lucian provided was a fortified manor on the edge of the capital, close enough to the palace for quick travel but isolated enough to defend. High walls, armed guards, multiple escape routes. It looked less like a home and more like a military installation pretending to be civilian. Catherine moved through the rooms with obvious relief, checking locks and sightlines with the paranoia of someone who'd seen threats materialize from darkness. It's secure, my lady. As secure as anywhere can be. Serafina stood in what would be her study, a room with windows facing the courtyard and walls thick enough to muffle screaming. The previous occupant had left behind a massive desk scarred with ink stains and knife marks. She ran her fingers over the gouges and wondered what battles had been fought here. My lady? Catherine's voice pulled her back. Some of the other servants from Blackthorn Manor are outside. They're asking if you're taking staff. How many? 12. Cook, 3 maids. The groundskeeper, some others. They say they'd rather serve you than find positions with families who collaborated with Lord Adrian. 12 people choosing loyalty over safety. 12 more responsibilities. 12 more targets if her enemies came calling. But also 12 allies who understood that the world was divided into those who enabled corruption and those who resisted it. Let them in. Have Cook make dinner for everyone. We're going to need our strength. Catherine left. Serafina remained in the study, looking out at grounds that would become her fortress, her prison, her launching point for whatever came next. She'd been a Duchess for 3 years and learned nothing except how to be decorative. Now she had weeks, maybe months, to learn how to be something else entirely. A steward arrived with the first batch of documents from Lucien's intelligence network. Files on noble families, dossiers on corrupt officials, maps of criminal operations that spanned the kingdom like a cancer. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. This wasn't a few bad actors. It was a system designed to concentrate power among people who saw ethics as obstacles. She started reading and didn't stop until dawn. Besen. The work consumed her. Every day brought new revelations about how deeply corruption had infected the kingdom. Noble families running illegal mining operations that worked prisoners to death. Military officers selling crown weapons to rebels and bandits. Magistrates taking bribes to convict the innocent and free the guilty. Tax collectors skimming funds meant for roads and hospitals and schools. And all of it protected by a web of mutual blackmail. Everyone had dirt on everyone else, creating a system where exposure meant mutually assured destruction. That's why Lucien had never been able to break it before. You couldn't arrest one corrupt noble without implicating 20 others who'd fight tooth and nail to prevent their own exposure. But Serafina had something Lucien didn't. She'd been inside that system. She knew which nobles were genuinely committed to corruption and which were trapped by circumstance or blackmail. She could identify pressure points, find the ones who might flip if offered immunity or protection. Lord Asherton, she told Lucien during one of their strategy sessions. He's embezzling from his own estate, but only because Duke Montrose threatened to reveal his son's gambling debts. Offer him protection, and he'll give us everything on Montrose's smuggling operations. Lucien made a note. You're certain he'll cooperate? His wife organized charity work with me for 2 years. She hates what her husband has become. Give them an exit, and they'll take it. And if they don't, then we destroy them too. But we should try the scalpel before the axe. He looked up from his notes, studying her face. You're getting good at this. I'm getting desperate at this. There's a difference. She gestured at the files covering the table. Every day we wait, more people suffer. More families lose their homes to corrupt debt collectors. More prisoners die in illegal work camps. The moral weight of inaction is starting to feel heavier than the risk of moving too fast. Careful. That kind of thinking leads to overreach. And your kind of thinking leads to paralysis. We need to find a middle path before one of us pulls too hard in our direction and breaks everything. It was the closest they'd come to arguing. The tension held for a moment, then Lucien nodded slowly. All right, we move on Asherton tomorrow. But if this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, we abort immediately. I won't risk exposing the larger operation for one target." Serafina agreed, but privately she knew they were running out of time. Word of her alliance with the crown prince had spread through the nobility like plague. Families were consolidating power, calling in favors, preparing defenses. If they didn't strike soon and strike hard, the window would close. Try it. Lord Asherton broke within an hour of being offered immunity. He didn't just give them Montrose's smuggling operations. He handed over documentation on a dozen other noble families involved in illegal trade. The man wept with relief as he signed the cooperation agreement, his wife clutching his hand like it was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. "Thank you," Lady Asherton whispered to Serafina as they left. "Thank you for seeing us as more than our worst choices." Serafina wanted to tell her that she understood, that she knew what it felt like to be trapped in a system that punished escape attempts more severely than compliance. But that would be a lie. She didn't forgive easily anymore. Asherton had allowed suffering to continue for years to protect his family's reputation. That he felt bad about it didn't absolve the damage. "Just make sure your testimony is detailed," she said instead. "A lot of people are counting on you telling the truth." After they left, Lucien leaned against the desk and smiled. "You're harder than you were a month ago." "Than I was a month ago, I was still pretending kindness and weakness were the same thing." Serafina began organizing the new documents Asherton had provided. "How long until we can move on Montrose?" 2 weeks to verify the evidence and build a prosecutable case. Then we arrest him publicly and use the scandal to pressure others into cooperating." He paused. "You realize this is going to trigger a reaction. The nobility will close ranks. There might be violence." "There's already violence. It's just been directed downward at people without power to fight back." She looked up at him. "That's what you hired me for, isn't it? To be the person willing to say the quiet part out loud. To acknowledge that reform requires breaking things and accepting that the broken pieces will cut everyone nearby. I hired you because you understand that systems don't change through polite requests. But I need you to understand something too. We're not going to save everyone. Some people will get caught in the crossfire. Some will lose everything even though they don't deserve it. Can you live with that?" Could she? A month ago, the answer would have been no. The gentle Duchess couldn't have accepted collateral damage, couldn't have prioritized the greater good over individual suffering. But that woman had died the night she found Adrian with Evelyn, and what remained was something colder, harder, more pragmatic. "I can live with it if the alternative is letting corruption continue because we're too afraid of imperfect solutions." She met his eyes. "Can you?" "I've been living with it for years. The question is whether you can do it without losing yourself completely." "I already lost myself. I'm just deciding what to build in the empty space." Lucien didn't respond, but something in his expression shifted. Not quite concern, not quite respect. Recognition, maybe. Of someone else who'd chosen purpose over peace. The arrest of Duke Montrose happened at noon in the central marketplace, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses. Lucien's guards moved with military precision, presenting evidence publicly before dragging the Duke away in chains. The crowd watched in stunned silence as one of the kingdom's most powerful nobles was treated like a common criminal. Serafina watched from a nearby building, hood pulled low, and felt nothing except clinical satisfaction. One more target eliminated, dozens more to go. But Montrose's arrest triggered exactly what Lucien had predicted. Within days, noble families began consolidating power, calling emergency councils, demanding the king intervene and stop the crown prince's witch hunt. That's what they called it, a witch hunt. As if investigating actual crimes was persecution. The propaganda campaign started immediately. Rumors spread that Serafina had seduced the crown prince, that she was manipulating him for personal revenge, that she was unstable and dangerous. Pamphlets appeared on street corners calling her the Crimson Villainess, a woman who'd destroyed her own husband and now threatened the kingdom's stability. The name stuck. Within a week, everyone from servants to senators was using it, some with fear, some with admiration, most with a combination of both. "They're trying to isolate you," Lucien said during one of their meetings. "Make you toxic so that anyone who supports you becomes guilty by association. It's effective. So what do? We lean into it." He spread several of the propaganda pamphlets across the table. "They want you to be a villain? Be one. But be the kind of villain who protects the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. Make them afraid of you for the right reasons. Serafina picked up one of the pamphlets, studying the crude illustration of herself as a demon in human skin. It should have hurt to see herself portrayed this way. Instead, she felt something like vindication. They were afraid. Finally, after a lifetime of being dismissed, she'd become something people took seriously. "I need to make a public appearance," she said. "Let them see me. Let them know I'm not hiding." That's suicide. The assassins will come whether I'm visible or not. At least if I'm public, they have to be more careful about the methods. Accidents in crowded markets draw scrutiny. She studied the illustration again. Set up a public forum. Announce that I'm answering questions about the investigation. Make it impossible to ignore. You're insane. No, I'm weaponizing the thing they're trying to use against me. Visibility. Lucienne stared at her for a long moment, then started laughing. Not with humor, but with the exhausted recognition of someone who'd found an equally reckless partner. Fine, but you're wearing armor under your dress, and we're stationing sharpshooters on every rooftop. Deal. The public forum happened in the old amphitheater on the edge of the noble quarter, neutral ground that both commoners and aristocrats could access. The crowd that gathered was massive, thousands of people crammed into stone seats, all wanting to see the woman who'd brought down a duke and become the kingdom's most controversial figure. Serafina stood on the central platform in a gown of deep crimson, the color they'd branded her with, now reclaimed as armor. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the amphitheater, making her look larger than she was. Lucienne stood off to one side with guards positioned at every exit. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "My name is Serafina Vale. You know me as the woman who destroyed her husband, as the crimson villainess, as the crown prince's attack dog." Her voice carried across the amphitheater, projecting in ways she'd learned from years of addressing charity galas. "You're here because you want to know if those things are true." The crowd was silent, waiting. "They are. I destroyed Duke Adrian Blackthorne because he was a criminal who used his title to commit treason, embezzlement, and murder. I work with Crown Prince Lucien because he's the only royal willing to investigate corruption instead of profiting from it. And yes, I'm dangerous, but only to people who thought their power made them untouchable." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted from the back, "You're just a scorned wife taking revenge." "You're right, I am scorned. My husband betrayed me, my cousin conspired against me, and the nobility I trusted treated me as a disposable asset, so I stopped being disposable. I learned how their systems worked, documented their crimes, and burned down everything they'd built on lies." She paused. "If that makes me a villain, fine. But ask yourself, what kind of kingdom calls seeking justice villainous while calling corruption normal?" Another voice, closer. "What about innocent people caught in your investigations? What about families destroyed because one member committed crimes?" Serafina turned toward the voice. "What about families destroyed because nobles stole their land through fraudulent debt? What about workers killed in illegal mines? What about prisoners executed without trial? You're asking me to care about the collateral damage of reform while ignoring the ongoing damage of corruption. I won't apologize for prioritizing the many over the few." "That's tyranny!" someone else shouted. "No. Tyranny is what we've been living under. This is accountability. It's messy and imperfect, and people will suffer who don't deserve it. But the alternative is allowing systematic abuse to continue because we're too afraid of disrupting comfort." She looked across the crowd. "I'm not asking you to like me. I'm asking you to decide whether you want justice or stability, because you can't have both right now." The amphitheater erupted. Some people cheering, some booing, most simply stunned by the bluntness. Serafina stood in the center of it all and felt power settle around her like a second skin. Not the borrowed power of a Duchess title, but something she'd earned through her willingness to be hated for doing what others wouldn't. A woman in the front row stood, elderly, dressed in worn clothing that marked her as working class. "My son was arrested 2 years ago on false charges because our landlord wanted our shop. He died in prison before we could appeal. Will you investigate that?" Serafina met her eyes. "Give your information to the Crown representatives at the exits. If there's evidence of corruption, yes, we'll investigate. And if you find it, will it matter? Will anything actually change?" That was the real question. The one Serafina asked herself every night, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm purpose. Would any of this matter? Would the system they were fighting change fundamentally or just adapt, finding new ways to protect the powerful?
I don't know, Serafina said honestly. I can't promise that exposing corruption will fix everything.
I can only promise that I won't stop trying, that I'll use every resource, every connection, every weapon I have to make the people responsible face consequences. That's all anyone can promise. The rest is just hope, and hope isn't a strategy. The old woman sat down slowly, nodding. Around the amphitheater, others were nodding too. Not agreement, exactly. Understanding, maybe. Recognition that the woman on the platform wasn't selling them fantasies but acknowledging the brutal reality of systemic change. The forum continued for 2 more hours. Questions, accusations, confessions from people who'd been victimized by corrupt nobles and saw Serafina as their first hope for justice. By the time it ended, she'd collected enough new leads to keep the investigation running for months. She'd also painted a target on herself that every noble in the kingdom could see. As they left the amphitheater under heavy guard, Lucien leaned close. That was either brilliant or suicidal. I haven't decided which.
Both.
It's always both. Serafina scanned the rooftops, looking for threats that could be anywhere. How long until they try again? Days, maybe hours. You've made yourself impossible to ignore and impossible to negotiate with. The only option left for your enemies is elimination. Good. Let them come. I'm tired of waiting for the knife. The knife came 3 days later. Not an assassin in the night, but something more insidious. A legal challenge claiming that Serafina's marriage to Adrian had never been properly annulled, which meant she was still technically Duchess Blackthorn and therefore liable for his crimes as his wife. It was transparent manipulation, a way to tie her up in courts and destroy her credibility. But it was also dangerous because technically, legally, they might have a case. Lucien spread the legal documents across the war room table they'd been using for strategy sessions. This is backed by Lord Voren. He's still under investigation, but not arrested yet, and he's using his remaining influence to attack through legal channels. Serafina read the documents with growing fury. They're claiming I knew about Adrian's crimes and profited from them, that my testimony against him is inadmissible because I'm an accomplice. It won't hold in court. We have evidence you cooperated with the investigation. It doesn't need to hold. It just needs to create doubt. To make people question whether I'm a victim or a co-conspirator. She threw the papers down. This is exactly what they do. When they can't win on facts, they muddy the water until truth becomes subjective. So we fight it. We present evidence of your cooperation, testimony from people you've helped. No. Serafina's voice was flat. We don't defend. We attack. What are you proposing? Voren is still free because you're building a case against him. Stop building. Arrest him now on what we have and force him to defend himself instead of attacking me. Make the narrative about his crimes, not my legitimacy. Lucien shook his head. We don't have enough for a solid conviction yet. If we move too early and he's acquitted, then we accept that risk because the alternative is letting him destroy my credibility while we gather evidence at a pace that prioritizes legal perfection over strategic timing. She met his eyes. You told me I was useful because I understood how to break systems. Well, this is how. We stop playing by rules designed to protect people like Voren and start making him react to us. That's not justice. That's vengeance. Justice is what you call vengeance when the powerful do it to the weak. Vengeance is what you call justice when the weak fight back. She leaned forward. I'm not interested in semantics. I'm interested in winning. Are you? The tension stretched between them like wire about to snap. Lucien looked at the documents, at her, at the map on the wall showing all the noble families they were targeting. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. If we do this, if we start arresting people before we have ironclad cases, we become exactly what they accuse us of being, tyrants using power to punish enemies. We're already accused of that. The difference is whether we let those accusations paralyze us or whether we acknowledge that sometimes the only way to fight monsters is to become monstrous. Serafina felt something settle in her chest, cold and final. I'm not asking you to compromise your principles. I'm asking you to decide whether you want to be right or effective. Because in this kingdom, right now, you can't be both. Lucien stared at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the documents and walked to the fireplace. Watched them burn. turned back to face her. Voren gets arrested tomorrow. We charge him with what we have and deal with the consequences. His expression was unreadable. But understand something. We're crossing a line here. Once we start moving faster than legal process allows, there's no going back. We become the thing we're fighting against. No. We become the thing necessary to fight against it. There's a difference, even if no one else sees it. You sure about that? Serafina looked at the flames consuming Voren's legal attack, at the map of nobles they were systematically destroying, at her own reflection in the window glass. She looked like someone capable of terrible things. Someone who'd learned that power didn't come from being right, but from being willing to act when others hesitated. I'm not sure of anything anymore except that standing still is the same as complicity. So yes, I'm sure we need to move. Whether that makes us heroes or villains, history can decide after we're dead. Lucien nodded slowly. Then we move. God help us both. But Serafina had stopped praying for help. Gods and kings and husbands, they were all the same. Distant authorities who demanded obedience and offered nothing but the promise that suffering had meaning if you endured long enough. She was done enduring, done waiting for rescue, done believing that playing by the rules would somehow make the game fair. The Crimson Villainess wasn't a role she'd chosen. It was a weapon they'd forged by breaking her and expecting her to stay broken. Now she'd teach them the cost of that mistake. One corrupt noble at a time, one burned system at a time, until nothing remained of the kingdom that had devoured her innocence except ashes and the names of those who'd learned too late that gentleness was a choice, not a weakness. And when they asked what she'd become in the process of destroying them, she'd tell them the truth, exactly what they made her. The arrest of Lord Voren happened at dawn before the city had time to wake and witness. Lucien's guards moved with the efficiency of men who'd done this before, dragging the king's advisor from his bed in silk nightclothes that made him look more vulnerable than powerful. No public spectacle this time. No crowds. Just the quiet execution of power that happened when the powerful finally turned on their own. Serafina watched from the shadows of a nearby building, hood pulled low, and felt nothing except the cold satisfaction of another piece removed from the board. Voren had orchestrated so much suffering from behind his advisor's desk, always insulated by layers of deniability and political connections. Now he'd learn what everyone else already knew. The protection only lasted as long as you were useful. Catherine stood beside her, silent and watchful in ways the maid had never been before the assassination attempts. Violence changed people, made them understand that the world was divided into those who acted and those who got acted upon. They're learning, Serafina thought, all of them. That gentleness is currency you spend when you can afford it, not a personality trait you're born with. The carriage ride back to the fortified manor was quiet, dawn light filtering through expensive glass, Catherine reviewing security protocols she'd memorized, Serafina running through the next targets on their list, Duke Rothmore, Countess Vesper, Baron Kellum, all implicated in Voren's schemes, all scrambling to distance themselves now that their patron had fallen. But something felt wrong. A tension in the air that had nothing to do with the usual paranoia of knowing assassins wanted her dead. This was different, a wrongness that lived in her gut where instinct warned of threats before logic caught up. The manor gates swung open. Guards in royal livery stood at attention. Everything normal, everything exactly as it should be, which was why Serafina knew something had broken. They entered through the main hall, and immediately the wrongness crystallized into certainty. Too quiet. The staff that should be preparing breakfast were absent, the usual morning sounds of a functioning household replaced by silence so complete it felt deliberate. Catherine's hand went to the knife she'd started carrying. "My lady." Lucien stepped from the study, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant catastrophe. "Serafina, we need to talk. Now. Not Lady Serafina. Not even Vale. Just her name, stripped of titles and formality. The way you addressed someone right before telling them their world had ended." She followed him into the study, Catherine trailing behind like a shadow that refused to separate. The door closed with a sound like a coffin sealing. Lucien moved to his desk but didn't sit, just stood there looking at documents spread across the wood like evidence at a crime scene. "What happened?" Serafina's voice came out steadier than she felt. Lucien picked up one of the documents. 3 hours ago, the king signed an emergency decree suspending my authority over corruption investigations. All evidence we've gathered is being transferred to a special committee of nobles who will review it for legitimacy. The words landed like blows. Serafina felt her mind racing to understand the implications. Your father, the king, just gutted our entire operation? Yes.
Why? Because we pushed too hard, too fast. Because arresting Voren crossed a line that made every noble in the kingdom realize they could be next. Because my father values stability over justice, and we threatened to destabilize everything. Lucian's jaw was tight. They're calling it a temporary measure while irregularities in our investigation are examined. But we both know what this really is. A coup. Serafina moved to the desk, scanning the documents with growing horror. They're not reviewing evidence, they're burying it. That special committee, let me guess, all nobles with ties to the families we've been investigating. Every single one.
Catherine made a small sound of distress. Serafina's mind went cold and sharp, cutting through the implications. They'd been winning. Piece by piece, arrest by arrest, they'd been dismantling the corrupt system. And that's exactly why the system had turned on them with institutional force. What about the cases we've already made? Blackthorn, Montrose, those stand, for now. But any new investigations are suspended pending committee approval, which means everyone we haven't arrested yet gets a reprieve while the committee slow walks every request into oblivion. Lucian finally sat, looking exhausted in ways she'd never seen. It's over, Serafina. We lost. No. The word came out hard. We lost. My father made that clear when he stripped my authority. The nobility closed ranks and he chose their stability over our justice. That's the reality we're dealing with. Serafina stared at him, watching the crown prince who'd promised partnership now retreating behind political calculus. Watching him choose survival over the war they'd been fighting together. And in that moment, she understood with perfect clarity that she'd made the oldest mistake in the world. She'd trusted someone with power to maintain principles when maintaining principles became inconvenient. You're giving up. It wasn't a question. I'm accepting that we can't win this fight. Not right now. Not with the entire royal court arrayed against us. Lucian met her eyes. I'm sorry. I know what this costs you. But if we keep pushing, my father will remove me from succession entirely, and then we'll have no power at all. There it was. The truth underneath all the partnership rhetoric and shared purpose. He'd been willing to fight corruption until that fight threatened his position, until principle collided with personal cost and he chose himself. Just like Adrian had, just like every man who'd ever promised her anything. So that's it? Serafina's voice was quiet, dangerous. We exposed 2 nobles and now we stop because doing more might hurt your political future? That's not fair, Fair? She laughed, sharp and bitter. You want to talk about fair? I destroyed my entire life to fight this corruption. I made myself the most hated woman in the kingdom. I sleep with guards outside my door and taste my food for poison and watch rooftops for snipers. I burned every bridge, sacrificed every relationship, became the villain they needed me to be. And you're walking away because your father asked nicely? I'm walking away because I don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. You're just choosing your crown over everything we built. The accusation hung between them like smoke. Lucian stood slowly, and when he spoke his voice was cold in ways she recognized from their first meeting. The voice of a prince, not a partner. You need to understand something, Serafina. I admire what you've done, truly. But you're not aristocracy anymore. You're not protected by birth or title or family connections. You're a witness in an investigation that's been officially suspended, which means you have exactly as much power as I choose to give you. And right now, I'm choosing to keep you alive by telling you to stop. The threat was implicit but clear. Stop fighting or lose royal protection. Stop fighting or become a target without any shield. Stop fighting or discover exactly how disposable you've always been. Serafina looked at this man she'd thought was different, this prince who'd seemed to understand that power meant nothing if you didn't use it for something beyond self-preservation. She looked at him and saw what she should have seen from the beginning. Just another man who wanted to use her until using her became too expensive. Get out, she said quietly. Serafina, get out of my house, now. Lucien's expression hardened. This isn't your house, it's crown property I allowed you to use. And I'm telling you as crown prince that you need to stop the investigation Accept the protection I'm still offering and let this go before you get yourself killed." I said, "Get out." He studied her face for a long moment, looking for something, compliance maybe, or fear, or the survival instinct that should have been screaming at her to back down. Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. "You're making a mistake. Wouldn't be my first, but at least this time I'm making it with my eyes open." Lucien left without another word. Catherine moved to the window, watching his carriage depart with guards in formation around it. When she turned back, her face was pale. "My lady, what do we do? Without the Crown Prince's support, we continue. But we can't. The investigation is suspended. The evidence is being seized. We have no legal authority. Since when have I cared about legal authority?" Serafina moved to the desk where Lucien had left the royal decree, reading it with the focus of someone looking for loopholes in a death sentence. "They're taking the evidence we've collected through official channels. Fine. They can have it. But they don't know about the copies I made, the documents I have hidden, the witnesses I've cultivated outside the investigation's official structure." Catherine's eyes widened. "You've been keeping a second set of evidence?" "I've been keeping 3 sets. One for official use, one for backup, and one that no one knows about except me. Because I learned my lesson from Adrian, never put all your leverage in one place where someone can take it from you." She looked up at her maid. "Tell the staff I need everyone who's willing to continue this fight to meet me in the library in 1 hour. Anyone who wants to leave has my blessing and a reference letter. But I need to know who stays." "My lady, if we do this without royal protection, we were always going to end up here, Catherine. The only question was how long it would take the powerful to realize I was serious about destroying them." Serafina felt something settle in her chest, cold and final as stone. "They thought threatening my safety would make me stop. They're about to learn that the woman who drove a hatpin through an assassin's eye isn't motivated by self-preservation anymore." An hour later, 9 people stood in the library. Catherine, cook, 3 other maids, the groundskeeper, 2 stable hands, and Marcus, a former royal guard who'd been quietly feeding Serafina information about palace security. 9 people out of the 12 who'd followed her from Blackthorn Manor. 3 had chosen survival over loyalty. Serafina didn't blame them, couldn't blame them. They'd signed up to serve a duchess, not a revolutionary. She looked at the faces of those who remained, working-class people with everything to lose and nothing to gain except the possibility that maybe, finally, someone would hold the powerful accountable. "The Crown has withdrawn support," she said without preamble. "The investigation is officially suspended. Everyone we've targeted gets to walk away unless we stop them. So here's the question, do we stop them?" Cook spoke first, her voice rough from years of shouting at kitchen staff. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but what can we do? We're servants. We don't have authority or weapons or... We have information. We have evidence of crimes that the Nobility Committee will bury. We have names, dates, locations of illegal operations, and we have something they don't expect from people like us." Serafina met each person's eyes in turn. "We have nothing left to lose. They can't threaten our positions because we've already thrown them away. They can't threaten our reputations because we never had any. The only thing they can take is our lives, and every person in this room has already accepted that risk by staying." Silence. Then Marcus stepped forward, his scarred hands clenched into fists. "My sister died in one of Duke Rothmore's illegal mines. Collapsed tunnel they never bothered to shore up properly because workers were cheaper than safety. She was 16. His voice cracked. "If you're still fighting, I'm with you. Authority be damned." The others nodded, some slowly, some with the desperate energy of people who'd been waiting their entire lives for permission to be angry about injustice. "Then here's what we do," Serafina said. "We can't arrest them anymore. We can't use the courts, but we can expose them. We take every piece of evidence and we make it public. Pamphlets, town criers, posted notices in every market and tavern in the capital. We tell the truth so loudly that even the committee trying to bury it can't silence us." "They'll kill us," one of the maids whispered. "Probably, but they're going to kill us anyway if we stop fighting. At least this way we die accomplishing something." Serafina pulled out the hidden documents she'd been keeping separate from the official investigation. 3 years of carefully recorded crimes that no one except her knew existed. "We start with Duke Rothmore. His mining operations, his worker deaths, his bribes to safety inspectors. We print 5,000 copies of this document and distribute them across the city before the nobility knows what's happening. How do we print 5,000 copies? Catherine asked practically. There's a printing press in the industrial district run by a man named Henrik, who publishes anti-nobility pamphlets. I've been funding him anonymously for 2 months. Time to collect on that investment. They worked through the night, planning distribution routes, identifying key locations for maximum visibility, preparing responses to the inevitable retaliation. By dawn, they had a strategy that was equal parts brilliant and suicidal, which felt appropriate for what they'd become. People with nothing to lose fighting against people who'd never lost anything. The pamphlets appeared on the 3rd day after Lucian's withdrawal. 5,000 copies exposing Duke Rothmore's crimes in detail, so specific and documented that even his allies couldn't dismiss it as rumor. Workers' names, death dates, bribes paid and to whom, collapsed tunnels with kill counts attached. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The nobility demanded investigations into who'd leaked classified information. The workers' guilds demanded justice for the deaths. Common people who'd never cared about palace intrigues suddenly had documentation of exactly how the aristocracy saw them, as disposable labor worth less than the cost of proper mine supports. Duke Rothmore was arrested within a week despite the committee's efforts to suppress the evidence. Public outrage made protection impossible. The streets erupted with protests that couldn't be contained by palace guards or ignored by a king who still pretended to care about popular opinion. Serafina watched it unfold from her fortified manor and felt vindication sharp as broken glass. They could take away her authority, but they couldn't take away her willingness to burn everything down if burning everything down was what justice required. But vindication came with a price. The night after Rothmore's arrest, Catherine burst into Serafina's study without knocking. Her face was white. She held a letter sealed with wax that Serafina didn't recognize. It was nailed to the front gate, Catherine said. The guards found it at dawn. Serafina broke the seal and read words that made her blood go cold. We have your family. Your mother, your younger brother, your aunt, and cousins. All of them currently guests in a secure location. Their safety depends entirely on your cooperation. You will cease all activities against noble families immediately. You will publicly recant your testimony against Duke Blackthorne and Lord Voren. You will disappear from public life. If you contact Crown Prince Lucian or any royal authority, they die. If you continue distributing pamphlets, they die. If you do anything except comply, they die. You have 3 days to respond. The letter wasn't signed, didn't need to be. Serafina recognized the tactics. Adrian had used similar threats against political rivals, leveraging family as collateral because everyone had someone they couldn't bear to lose. She just never expected them to use it against her. Catherine's voice seemed to come from far away. My lady, what do we do? What did they do? Serafina's mind raced through options, each one ending in blood. She could contact Lucien despite the threat, but he'd already withdrawn support, and even if he helped, would it be fast enough? She could call their bluff and continue the fight, but what if it wasn't a bluff? What if her family died because she chose principle over people? Her mother who'd cried at her wedding, her brother who'd written letters every week asking how married life was treating her, her aunt and cousins who'd never done anything except have the misfortune of being related to a woman who'd declared war on the kingdom's power structure. All of them held hostage because she'd refused to stay silent. We verify the threat, Serafina heard herself say. Send Marcus to my family's estate. If they're truly missing, we'll know this is real. Marcus left within the hour, returned before noon with confirmation that made Serafina's stomach drop. The Vale estate was deserted, signs of struggle, servants fled or taken with the family. It was real, all of it real. She sat in her study surrounded by evidence of noble corruption while somewhere her family was being held captive. The righteous anger that had sustained her for months felt hollow now, replaced by the sick realization that her crusade had consequences for people who'd never chosen to be part of it. This was the cost of refusing to back down. This was what happened when you fought monsters who had nothing resembling limits or honor. They didn't come for you directly. They came for everyone you'd ever loved and made you choose between justice and humanity. Catherine stood at this window, silent. The rest of the staff had gathered in the hall, waiting for instructions that Serafina didn't have. How did you calculate this equation? How many noble criminals could she allow to escape justice to save 5 innocent people? How many workers' deaths in illegal mines equaled one mother's life? There was no good answer, just choices that would haunt her regardless of which path she took. I need to think, she said finally. Everyone out. Now. They left. Serafina sat alone with the letter and felt the weight of every decision she'd made since finding Adrian with Evelyn. This was supposed to be simple. Expose corruption, punish criminals, break the system that enabled abuse. But nothing was simple when the powerful fought back with tactics that targeted your humanity instead of your logic. If she complied, her family lived. But every worker who died in an illegal mine after she stopped fighting would be her responsibility. Every victim of noble corruption who suffered because she chose personal loyalty over systemic change. If she refused to comply, she became directly responsible for her family's deaths. Could she live with that? Could she look in a mirror knowing she'd sacrificed people she loved for an abstract principle about justice? Hours passed. Night fell. Serafina sat in darkness and understood with terrible clarity that there was no winning move, just losing slower or faster. The door opened quietly. Marcus entered without permission, his expression grim. "My lady, there's someone here to see you. Says he has information about your family." Hope flared painfully. "Who?" "He wouldn't give a name, just said you'd want to hear what he knows." Serafina followed Marcus to the parlor where a man waited in shadows. When he stepped into lamplight, she recognized him immediately. One of Adrian's former stewards, a man named Thomas, who disappeared after Adrian's arrest. She'd assumed he'd fled to avoid prosecution. Apparently she'd assumed wrong. "Lady Serafina." Thomas bowed slightly, his face haggard. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but we don't have much time." "You know where my family is?" "I know who took them, and why. But before I tell you, you need to understand something. I've spent 3 months running from people who want me dead because I know too much. I'm only here because what's happening to you is worse than what I was trying to avoid." "Who took them?" The question came out sharp as breaking bone. Thomas pulled a document from his jacket, correspondence with a seal she recognized. Her blood went cold. "Crown Prince Lucian," Thomas said quietly. "Your family was taken on his orders." The words didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. Lucian had withdrawn support, but he wouldn't. "You're lying." "I wish I was." Thomas spread the document on the table. "This is an order signed by Prince Lucian authorizing the detention of the Vale family under Crown security protocols. The official justification is protective custody during a time of civil unrest. The real reason is leverage against you." Serafina's hand shook as she picked up the document. It was real. The signature was real. Everything was real, and none of it made sense with the man who'd promised partnership. "Why?" Her voice cracked. "Why would he?" "Because you didn't stop when he told you to. Because you've become a threat to royal stability. Because the prince isn't interested in justice if justice requires destabilizing the kingdom." Thomas's expression was sympathetic in a way that made her want to scream. "He worked with you as long as it served his purposes. When you became more dangerous than useful, he removed you from the board the only way that wouldn't make you a martyr, by forcing you to remove yourself." Catherine had followed them and now stood frozen in the doorway. "The Crown Prince betrayed us?" "The Crown Prince did what powerful people always do. He prioritized his interests over yours." Thomas looked at Serafina. "I'm sorry. I know you trusted him." Trusted. Past tense. Because the present tense was betrayal so complete it made Adrian's infidelity look almost honest by comparison. Adrian had at least been transparent in his contempt. Lucien had wrapped his manipulation in the language of partnership and principle, right up until the moment those principles threatened his position. Serafina sat down slowly, feeling something break inside her chest that had nothing to do with heartbreak and everything to do with rage so pure it crystallized into diamond-hard clarity. They'd all betrayed her, every single one, Adrian with his cousin, Evelyn with her ambition, the nobility with their systemic corruption, and now Lucien with this, holding her family hostage while pretending it was someone else, forcing her to choose between justice and the people she loved. "How do I get them back?" Her voice sounded foreign, cold, something new emerging from the wreckage of who she'd been. "You can't. Not through negotiation or compliance.
The prince won't release them unless you're completely neutralized, and even then he might keep them as insurance against you resurging. Thomas hesitated. There's only one way to force his hand. Tell me.
You have to become more dangerous than keeping your family is worth. You have to threaten something he values more than he values using them as leverage. And what does he value more than control? Thomas smiled grimly. His legitimacy, his claim to the throne, his father's confidence in his judgment. You want your family back? You threaten to expose that the crown prince kidnapped innocent nobles under false pretenses. You make it a scandal that would destroy his political future. I don't have proof, just your word and this document, which could be forged. Then get proof. Break into the location where they're being held. Document the conditions. Rescue them yourself and make sure everyone knows who took them. Thomas's expression hardened. I'm not saying it will work. I'm saying it's your only option besides compliance that leads to your family disappearing permanently once you're no longer useful to threaten. Serafina looked at the document, at Thomas, at Catherine's horrified face. She thought about Lucien's careful withdrawal of support, his warning that she had as much power as he chose to give her, his implicit threat wrapped in concern for her safety. She'd been so focused on fighting external enemies that she'd missed the one standing beside her, waiting for the moment she became inconvenient. Where are they being held? Thomas pulled out a map. Crown facility outside the city, former military prison, now used for sensitive detentions, heavily guarded. Attacking it directly would be suicide. Good thing I've gotten comfortable with suicidal plans. My lady, Catherine started. No. Serafina stood, feeling something settle into place that had been fragmenting since the moment she'd found Adrian with Eveline. I'm done being leveraged, done being threatened, done making myself smaller so that powerful men feel less threatened. They want to know what happens when they push someone until they have nothing left to lose? They're about to find out. She turned to Marcus. How many people do we have who can fight? Including me? 4 who have military training, maybe 6 others who can handle themselves in violence. 10 people against a fortified crown facility. The odds were laughable. But Serafina had learned something important over the past months. Odds only mattered if you were trying to survive. When survival meant accepting slavery to people who demonstrated they'd never stop controlling you, then odds became irrelevant. You fought anyway. Not because you'd win, but because losing while fighting was better than living while kneeling. Get everyone ready. We move at dawn. She looked at Thomas. You're coming with us. I need someone who knows crown security protocols. I was afraid you'd say that. The preparations took all night, acquiring weapons they'd never thought to stockpile, planning an assault they weren't qualified to execute, writing letters to be delivered if they died, containing all the evidence they'd gathered and instructions on how to use it. Catherine worked beside Serafina in silence until finally she spoke. We're going to die doing this. Probably. Was it worth it? Everything we've done? The investigation? The exposures? Making enemies of everyone with power? Was any of it worth ending like this? Serafina looked at the evidence of corruption spread across her desk. Thought about the workers' families they'd helped. The justice they'd forced on nobles who'd operated with impunity for decades. The system they'd proven could be challenged even if they couldn't destroy it completely. I don't know. Ask me after we're dead. Dawn came cold and clear. 10 people armed with whatever weapons they could gather, preparing to assault a crown facility defended by trained soldiers. It was insane, desperate, the action of people who'd been pushed past the point where survival instinct overrode purpose. But as Serafina led them out of the manor gates toward whatever waited at that prison, she felt something like peace, not acceptance, not surrender, just the clarity that came from finally understanding what she'd become. Not a duchess, not a victim, not even a revolutionary, just a woman who'd learned the hardest lesson the world taught, that power respected nothing except the willingness to burn everything down rather than accept subjugation, that the only way to fight monsters was to become monstrous enough that threatening you cost more than letting you exist. They'd made her this. Adrian and Eveline and Lucien and every noble who'd looked at vulnerable people and seen resources to exploit. They'd shattered her innocence and expected her to stay broken. Instead, she'd weaponized the pieces. And now they'd learn what happened when you created something you couldn't control and expected it to thank you for the lesson. The prison rose before them in the dawn light, Stone walls and iron gates and guards who had no idea they were about to face something they'd never been trained to fight. Not an army, not a rebellion, just one woman who decided that if she was going to lose everything, she'd make sure everyone responsible lost with her. Serafina looked at the fortress holding her family and felt no fear, no hesitation, just cold certainty that whatever happened next, she'd never kneel again. Not to kings, not to princes, not to anyone. They'd wanted a villain. They were about to get a war. The approach to the crown facility was tactical silence, broken only by breathing and the soft scrape of boots against frost-hardened ground. 10 people moving through pre-dawn darkness toward a fortress that held everything Serafina had left to lose. The cold bit through her coat, but she barely felt it. Pain was just information now. Fear was just data about what might happen if you hesitated. She'd stopped hesitating the moment she realized Lucian had taken her family. Thomas moved beside her, his face gaunt in the pale light. He'd drawn crude maps from memory during the night, guard rotations, blind spots in the walls, the interior layout of cells where political detainees were held. Former military prison meant it was built to keep people in, not defend against assault from outside. That was the only advantage they had. That and desperation sharp enough to cut through training. Marcus signaled halt from the front. They'd reached the outer perimeter, a stone wall 12 feet high topped with iron spikes. Guards visible on the parapets, their breath misting in cold air, crossbows slung across shoulders. Professional. Alert. Men doing a job who had no idea they were guarding kidnapped nobles on a crown prince's orders. Serafina felt something twist in her chest that might have been sympathy if she could still afford that luxury. These guards were just following orders, just serving their prince, just doing what the system told them was right. None of that would save them if they stood between her and her family. She'd learned the hardest truth about power, that everyone was disposable when survival was at stake. The guards, her staff, herself. All of them just pieces on a board where the only winning move was refusing to be played. Catherine crouched beside her, knife drawn, hands steady despite the fear Serafina could see in her eyes. The maid had come so far from the timid girl who'd served tea and avoided conflict. Violence changed people, made them understand that the difference between victim and survivor was just willingness to inflict the pain you'd learned to endure. Marcus moved back from his forward position. 2 guards on the east wall, 4 at the main gate. Unknown number inside. If we're doing this, we need to move before dawn shift change brings reinforcements. How do we get inside? One of the stable hands whispered. Thomas pointed to a section of wall where ivy had grown thick over stone. Service entrance, used for supply deliveries. 2 guards inside, but it opens directly into the lower cells. If we can breach there, we'll be trapped in a corridor with armed soldiers ahead and behind, Marcus finished. It's a kill box. Everything is a kill box once they know we're here. Serafina checked the stolen crossbow she'd never fired before tonight. The question is whether we're willing to walk into it anyway. She saw the answer in their faces. Fear mixed with resolution. The look of people who'd already accepted death and were just negotiating terms. They'd followed her this far through assassination attempts and royal betrayal. They'd stay with her through whatever came next because turning back meant accepting that power could always threaten what you loved and force compliance. Some lessons you only learned by refusing to learn them. Thomas, Marcus, you take 4 people through the service entrance. Create noise, draw guards away from the main cell block. Catherine, Cook, and the rest, with me through the main gate. Serafina met each person's eyes. If this goes wrong and I die, the evidence gets delivered to every printing press in the capital. Lucienne loses everything. That's the only justice I can guarantee. And if we succeed, Catherine asked, then we document everything, get proof that the crown is holding my family illegally, force Lucian to release them rather than face exposure. She paused. But success isn't likely, so make peace with whatever you need to make peace with. They separated into 2 groups. Serafina led her team around the perimeter toward the main gate, where 4 guards stood in formation. Professional soldiers doing legitimate work for illegitimate purposes. She thought about the workers who died in illegal mines, the families destroyed by corrupt nobles, all that suffering enabled by people just following orders. At what point did following orders become participation in atrocity? At what point did doing your job make you complicit in the system that jobs served? She'd stopped asking those questions weeks ago. There were no clean answers, just choices about which side of violence you stood on. 50 feet from the gate. The guards hadn't seen them yet. Serafina's heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to hurt, sweat despite the cold. Her mouth tasted like copper and fear and the particular flavor of moments where everything hinged on whether you'd freeze or move forward. She moved forward. The crossbow bolt took the first guard in the throat before he could shout warning. He went down gurgling, surprise frozen on his face. The second guard reached for his weapon and Marcus was on him, knife finding the gap between helmet and armor with the precision of someone who'd killed before. The other two guards managed to raise alarm before Cook hit one with a cooking mallet to the skull, and Serafina drove her knife into the fourth guard's chest. Not clean, not heroic, just brutal efficiency born from the understanding that mercy toward people trying to kill you was suicide dressed as virtue. The alarm bell shattered the pre-dawn quiet. Serafina grabbed keys from a dead guard and ran for the gate mechanism. Behind her, more guards were emerging from the barracks, shouting, crossbow bolts whining through air. One of her people screamed. She didn't look back to see who. Couldn't afford to. The gate mechanism was complex, multiple locks, designed to be opened from inside by people who weren't being shot at. Catherine appeared beside her, breathing hard, blood on her face that might have been hers or someone else's. "My lady, we need to move." The gate lock surrendered. Serafina shoved it open and they poured inside into a courtyard lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on stone. More guards appearing from multiple directions. The killbox Marcus had warned about materializing exactly as predicted. They were going to die here. That was the probability. But probability only mattered if you were trying to optimize outcomes. When the outcome was already determined by forces beyond your control, the only thing left was defiance. Serafina raised her crossbow and fired into the mass of guards. Missed. Grabbed the sword from a fallen soldier and discovered she had no idea how to use it properly, but desperation made you creative. Block, slash, duck under a blow that would have taken her head off. Drive the blade into someone's gut and feel it catch on bone and twist it anyway because stopping meant dying. Around her, her people were fighting with the same desperate energy. Cook swinging her mallet like it was designed for skulls instead of meat. Catherine with twin knives moving faster than Serafina had ever seen her move. Marcus coordinating defense like the soldier he'd been before corruption had driven him to her service. But there were too many guards, too many weapons. They were being pushed back toward the gate, losing ground, losing people. One of the stable hands went down with a spear through his chest. Another was surrounded and cut down while Serafina watched helplessly from 30 feet away. This was the cost, the collateral damage of fighting when you had no right to win. People died for your principles. People who'd trusted you enough to follow into suicide missions. Their blood was on your hands as much as any enemy's. An explosion rocked the far side of the compound. Thomas and his team breaching the service entrance. The guards' attention split between two threats. Serafina used the confusion to break toward the cell block entrance, Catherine and 3 others following while Marcus held the courtyard with the remainder. Inside the facility was narrow corridors and locked doors. Emergency lighting casting everything in harsh shadows. Guards emerging from side passages. Serafina shot one with a crossbow she'd grabbed from somewhere. Catherine threw a knife that took another in the eye. They were moving on instinct now, past the point where thought and action were separate processes. Thomas appeared from across corridor, his group down to 2. "The cells are below, but there's a garrison between us and them, 20 soldiers at least. Then we go through them. That's suicide. Everything we've done tonight is suicide. The only question is what we accomplish before we die." Serafina's voice was steady, despite her hands shaking, despite the blood soaking through her clothes from wounds she hadn't registered receiving, despite knowing that she'd led these people into a death trap, and the only way to justify it was succeeding. "Get me to my family. That's all I need." They descended stairs slick with moisture and old blood. The garrison Thomas had warned about was positioned at the bottom, professional soldiers in formation, shields, and spears. The kind of defense that couldn't be broken by 10 desperate people with improvised tactics. Except they weren't 10 anymore. Maybe 6. And the desperation wasn't improvised. It was refined through months of having everything taken and learning that the only power left was the power to destroy what couldn't be saved. Serafina looked into the formation and understood they couldn't win. Not through force, not through tactics. The only option was making the guards choose between their orders and their survival instinct. She stepped into view at the top of the stairs, alone, hands raised. I need to see my family, that's all. No one else has to die. The garrison commander stepped forward, a scarred veteran with eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by violence. Lady Seraphina Vale, you're under arrest for assault on crown property and murder of royal guards. I know, I'll surrender after I see my family. No negotiations. Drop your weapons and come down slowly. Seraphina pulled a document from inside her coat, the last copy of evidence detailing every crime she'd documented. This gets delivered to every printer in the capital if I don't walk out of here with my family. It details Crown Prince Lucian's illegal detention of noble citizens, his coordination with corrupt families, his betrayal of his own investigation. You want to arrest me? Fine. But my family walks free or I burn his reputation so thoroughly he'll never recover. The commander's expression didn't change. The prince anticipated you'd attempt blackmail. He's authorized me to tell you that your family is safe and will be released once you surrender. You have his word. His word. Seraphina almost laughed. The word of a man who'd promised partnership, then kidnapped her family when she became inconvenient. The word of a prince who saw people as assets to be leveraged or eliminated. The word of someone who'd learned from the same corrupt system she was trying to destroy that power meant never having to keep promises to the powerless. I don't want his word. I want proof they're alive. Not possible. Surrender now or we come up and take you. This was the calculation. Surrender and hope. Lucien kept his word despite having no reason to. Or fight and guarantee everyone died, including her family. Or find a third option that didn't exist in the space between those two impossibilities. Catherine touched her arm. My lady, we can't fight through them. I know. So what do we do? Seraphina looked at the garrison commander, at the soldiers behind him, at the corridor leading to cells where her family was held. She thought about every choice that had led to this moment, every compromise she'd refused, every time she'd chosen principle over pragmatism, every person who died because she'd been too stubborn to accept that some battles couldn't be won. She thought about what it meant to be dangerous. Not threatening violence, anyone could threaten, but demonstrating willingness to accept consequences that would destroy everyone involved rather than submit to subjugation. That was the power she had left, the power to lose spectacularly enough that everyone lost with her. Tell Prince Lucien I'm coming to see him, she said quietly. Not to negotiate, not to surrender, to show him what happens when you push someone until they stop caring whether they survive. The commander frowned. The prince isn't here. Then take me to wherever he is, because this ends today, either with my family free or with everyone discovering exactly what their crown prince has been doing. That's not how this works. Seraphina pulled a tinderbox from her pocket and held it over the document. The copies of this evidence are already distributed with instructions to deliver them if I don't return. But this is my personal copy, the one with annotations, names of witnesses who haven't testified yet, locations of additional evidence. Burn it and you save the prince some exposure, but that only happens if you get me to him in the next hour. The commander studied her face, looking for bluff, for weakness, for any sign that she wasn't serious about destroying everything. He wouldn't find it, because the woman who'd cared about self-preservation was long dead. What remained was someone who understood that the only leverage the powerless had was the ability to make their destruction expensive. Stand down, the commander told his soldiers. We're taking Lady Seraphina to the prince, alive. Catherine started to protest, but Seraphina silenced her with a look. Stay here. Guard the entrance. If I'm not back by noon, deliver the evidence. My lady, you can't. I can and I will. This was always where it ended. Just me and Lucien and the truth about what partnership means to people who have crowns. She handed Catherine the document. If he kills me, make sure it costs him everything. They took her weapons, bound her hands, led her upstairs and through corridors stained with blood from the people she'd led into this disaster. The courtyard was quiet now except for groaning wounded and the crackle of fires. Marcus was still alive, barely, being tended by Cook. The others were scattered across stone in positions that told stories of how they'd died. For her, because she'd convinced them that justice was worth dying for. She'd been wrong about so many things, but maybe not that. Maybe the only way to prove that power had limits was demonstrating willingness to die rather than accept that it didn't. They put her in a carriage under heavy guard. Dawn was breaking over the city, painting everything in shades of red that felt appropriate for what was coming. The streets were empty except for early workers who stared at the military convoy and probably wondered what crime deserved this much security. The crime of refusing to stay silent. The crime of believing that truth mattered more than comfort. The crime of thinking that one woman could challenge a system that had spent centuries perfecting the art of crushing resistance. The carriage stopped at a manor she recognized, one of Lucien's private properties, not the palace. Somewhere he could conduct business that needed to stay off official records. They led her inside to a study that looked more like a war room, maps and documents covering every surface. Lucien stood at the window, his back to her, silhouette sharp against morning light. When he turned, his expression was carefully neutral. "Serafina, you've made quite a mess. You kidnapped my family. I placed them in protective custody during a period of civil unrest you created." He moved to a desk, poured 2 glasses of wine as if this was a social visit. "You were becoming dangerous, to yourself and others. I needed leverage to make you see reason." "Reason? Is that what you call forcing compliance through hostages?" "I call it preventing you from starting a civil war." He offered her a glass. When she didn't take it, he set it down. "You exposed Duke Rothmore without authorization. You distributed classified evidence. You've turned half the working class against the nobility, and the other half is waiting to see which side wins. That's not justice, Serafina. That's chaos. Justice looks like chaos to people who've only ever seen order maintained through oppression. Spare me the revolutionary rhetoric. You're not some freedom fighter. You're a woman with a grudge using noble suffering as justification for personal revenge." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Because part of it was true. She had wanted revenge, had wanted to watch Adrian and everyone like him suffer the way she'd suffered. But somewhere along the way, it had become more than that. Become about the workers' families and the prisoners and everyone crushed under a system that treated human beings as disposable. Hadn't it? Or was Lucien right? Was all of this just elaborate self-justification for personal vendetta?
"I want my family," she said quietly. "Release them, and I'll stop." "Will you?"
"Because we've had this conversation before. I withdrew support and you continued. I warned you and you escalated. Why should I believe that releasing your family will make you stop instead of just removing the leverage I have? Because I'm tired. Because I've lost too many people. Because even I have limits." She met his eyes. "I'll sign whatever agreement you want. Public recantation, exile, complete silence. Just give them back." Lucien studied her face for a long moment. Then he pulled a letter from his desk and handed it to her. She recognized her brother's handwriting immediately. The letter was dated 3 days ago, brief, terrified, begging her to stop the investigation before something terrible happened to their family. "Your brother wrote that before we took them into custody," Lucien said quietly. "He knew you wouldn't stop for anything except their safety. He was trying to save you from yourself." The letter shook in Serafina's bound hands. Her brother, who'd written cheerful updates about his studies and his terrible attempts at poetry, who'd never understood politics or corruption or why his sister had become the kingdom's most controversial figure, who just wanted his family safe. She'd put him in danger, put all of them in danger, because she couldn't let go of the need to punish everyone who'd wronged her. "Where are they?" Her voice cracked. "Safe. I promise you, Serafina, they're safe. But their continued safety depends on you making the right choice." He moved closer, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I know you think I betrayed you. From your perspective, maybe I did. But from mine, I'm trying to save the kingdom from civil war. And I'm trying to save you from becoming the monster you're fighting against. I'm already a monster. You helped make me one. No. You're someone who's been hurt and who learned to hurt back. That's human. But it doesn't have to define you." He gestured at the window where dawn light was growing stronger. "Sign the agreement. Take your family somewhere far from court politics. Rebuild your life. Let me handle reforming the system at a pace that won't tear everything apart." It was reasonable, logical, the kind of compromise that adults made when absolute victory wasn't possible. She'd get her family back. They'd be safe. She'd survive. And all it cost was accepting that the powerful would always win because they had the patience and resources to wait out resistance. All it cost was everything she'd become. And the nobles we exposed? She asked. Blackthorn, Montrose, Rothmore, what happens to them? They'll face justice. Modified justice, maybe. Exile rather than execution. Fines rather than complete ruin. But they won't escape consequences entirely. Modified justice. The kind that let powerful people avoid the full weight of their crimes, because full weight would destabilize too much. The kind that prioritized comfort over accountability. The kind that ensured nothing would fundamentally change. Serafina looked at Lucian and saw clearly what she should have seen months ago. He wasn't evil. Wasn't even particularly corrupt. He was just someone who'd been raised to value stability over everything else. Who'd learned that systems mattered more than individuals. That order had to be preserved, even if that order was unjust. He would reform things. Probably. Make incremental improvements. Reduce the worst abuses. And in 100 years, maybe the kingdom would be moderately better than it was now. But the workers dying in mines today wouldn't see that improvement. The prisoners in illegal facilities wouldn't benefit from gradual reform. The families destroyed by corrupt nobles wouldn't be made whole by patience. They needed justice now. Not eventually. Not after careful consideration. Now.
I can't sign it, said quietly. Lucian's expression hardened. Then you're choosing their deaths. No, you are. By holding them hostage, by treating human beings as leverage, by deciding that your vision of order matters more than their freedom. She met his eyes. I'm choosing to refuse the deal that lets you pretend you're not responsible. That's insane. You're killing them. I'm refusing to be the reason you can claim you had no choice. If you hurt my family, that's your decision. Own it. Don't hide behind my refusal to comply. The silence stretched between them like wire about to snap. Lucien's face cycled through emotions, anger, frustration, something that might have been respect if respect was compatible with rage. You're willing to let them die for your principles. I'm willing to stop letting people threaten the vulnerable and face no consequences because everyone's too afraid to call their bluff. Serafina's voice was steady despite her heart hammering. You're not going to kill my family, Lucian, because if you do, every piece of evidence I have gets released and you become the prince who murdered innocent nobles. That destroys you politically. So you're bluffing. And I'm done pretending powerful people's bluffs are real just because they have the ability to hurt people. Lucian stared at her. You're gambling with their lives. You are. I'm just refusing to let you make it my fault when you lose. The calculation played across his face. The weighing of options. The recognition that she'd trapped him the same way he'd tried to trap her, by making the cost of victory higher than he was willing to pay. You're right, he said finally. I won't kill them, but I also won't release them. They stay in custody, comfortable custody, treated well, but custody nonetheless. Insurance that you won't restart your campaign. For how long? For as long as it takes you to understand that some fights can't be won. So this was the compromise. Her family alive but imprisoned indefinitely. Her crusade ended but not forgiven. Everyone losing just enough that no one could claim victory. It was pragmatic, realistic. The kind of ugly solution that adults accepted when idealism collided with reality. Serafina looked at the letter from her brother and felt something inside her chest finally break. Not heartbreak. Something colder. The last fragment of hope that there was a clean way to fight corruption. The justice could be achieved without everyone you loved paying the price. I need proof they're safe, she said. Not your word, actual proof. Lucian nodded to a guard who left and returned minutes later with something that made Serafina's breath catch. A small portrait miniature that had belonged to her mother. Something she never traveled without. Fresh proof. Recent proof. They were alive. You'll get monthly confirmations, Lucian said. As long as you stay quiet. As long as she accepted permanent leverage, permanent control, permanent reminder that she'd lost. But they were alive. That had to matter more than pride, didn't it? I need to see Catherine and the others, the ones who survived. They're being treated. You can visit them before you leave. Leave. Going somewhere far from the capital, somewhere safe and irrelevant. The fate of women who challenged power. Exile dressed as mercy. The The guards led her through corridors to a medical room where Catherine lay on a cot, bandaged and pale but breathing. Marcus was there too, unconscious but stable. Cook was tending to others who'd survived the assault. Catherine's eyes focused on Seraphina. "My lady, did you—" "They're alive, my family, but they stay imprisoned unless I stop." Seraphina sat beside the cot, her bound hands making the gesture awkward. "I'm sorry. I led you into that and it accomplished nothing." "It accomplished everything." Catherine's voice was weak but certain. "We showed them we wouldn't break. That's not nothing." But it felt like nothing. Felt like all that blood and sacrifice had just resulted in a stalemate where the powerful stayed powerful and the resistant stayed controlled. Seraphina looked at the people who'd followed her into suicide missions and wondered what she'd really accomplished besides teaching them that resistance was possible and futile simultaneously. "Get better," she told Catherine. "All of you. And if you're smart, you'll find positions far from me. I'm too dangerous to stand near." "With respect, my lady, we knew that before we followed you." Catherine managed a weak smile. "Some things are worth the danger." The guards took Seraphina to a carriage that would transport her to exile. Comfortable exile, probably. Lucian wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake, just ruthlessly pragmatic about neutralizing threats. She looked back at the manor where her family was held somewhere in cells disguised as guest rooms. Thought about the choice she'd made not to sign his agreement. The choice to call his bluff, even knowing it meant her family stayed imprisoned. Had it been the right choice? Or had she just been too proud to accept compromise? She didn't know. Wouldn't know until years from now when history decided whether she'd been a hero or a cautionary tale about what happened when you refused to bend. The carriage door opened. Lucian stood there, his expression unreadable. "Last chance," he said. "Sign the agreement. I'll release your family immediately." Seraphina looked at the document he held, at the prince offering mercy in exchange for silence, at the clean exit from a war she was losing. She thought about Adrian and Evelyn, about the nobles who'd escaped full justice because reform required patience, about workers who'd die in mines while everyone waited for gradual improvement. She thought about what kind of person she'd become if she accepted this deal. Safe, alive, silent, complicit. "No," she said quietly. Lucien's expression shifted to something that might have been admiration if admiration wasn't compatible with frustration. "Then you're a fool." "Probably. But I'd rather be a fool who fought than someone smart who knew better than to try." He closed the carriage door. The driver snapped the reins. They pulled away from the manor toward whatever exile waited in provinces far from court intrigue. Seraphina watched the capital disappear behind her and felt nothing except exhaustion. She'd gambled everything, lost most of it, saved her family's lives but not their freedom, exposed corruption but not enough to destroy it. She'd become exactly what they called her, the Crimson Villainess, the woman too dangerous to let win but too stubborn to completely break. And somewhere in cells disguised as protection, her family waited for her to either rescue them or accept that some prisons couldn't be escaped. She hadn't decided which yet. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over. Not really, just interrupted. Because the lesson she'd learned fighting corruption and betrayal and every form of power that thought it could control her was simple. You only truly lost when you stopped being willing to burn everything down to win. And Seraphina was still holding matches. The exile estate sat at the edge of the kingdom, where forests gave way to mountains, and civilization thinned to scattered villages that barely remembered they owed allegiance to a crown. 3 months Seraphina had been here. 3 months of silence broken only by wind through trees and the occasional report from Catherine about conditions in the capital. The reports were always the same. Her family remained in comfortable captivity. Lucien continued his gradual reforms at a pace designed to disturb no one. The nobility had closed ranks tighter than ever, learning from the near collapse that solidarity was survival. And the common people who'd briefly believed change was possible had returned to their lives with the weary acceptance of those who'd seen revolution promised and stability delivered instead. Everything had returned to normal, except Seraphina. She stood at the window of what passed for a study in this provincial manor, watching dawn paint the mountains in shades that reminded her of blood. She'd aged in these 3 months, not in years, but in the way trauma ages you,
lines around her eyes from nights without sleep, a hardness in her expression that came from learning exactly how much you could lose and still keep breathing. Catherine entered without knocking, carrying tea and the latest correspondence from the capital. The maid had recovered from her wounds but moved differently now, with the careful precision of someone who'd learned their body could be broken. They all carried scars from that night at the prison, physical ones and the deeper kind that never fully healed. You learned to live with both, or you didn't live at all. "Anything interesting?" Serafina asked without turning from the window. "Lord Voren was released from prison yesterday, exiled to his family estates, fortune intact, title suspended but not revoked." Catherine's voice was flat. "Duke Montrose negotiated a settlement, paid fines, apologized publicly, keeps his position. Baron Kellum was never charged. Insufficient evidence after the committee review." So that was what justice looked like when the powerful investigated themselves. Slaps on wrists, stern lectures, modifications to behavior that would last exactly as long as public attention remained focused. Then everything would slide back to comfortable corruption. Serafina had known this would happen, had known from the moment Lucian withdrew support that the system would protect itself. But knowing didn't make it hurt less, didn't make the faces of workers who died in illegal mines any less haunting, didn't make the sacrifices of people who'd followed her into that prison any less wasteful. She'd failed. Not partially, completely. The nobles she'd exposed were mostly free. Her family remained imprisoned in all but name. And she was here in exile, neutralized, a cautionary tale about what happened when you challenged power without enough power to win. "There's something else," Catherine said quietly. "A letter. Personal. From Crown Prince Lucian." Serafina took the sealed envelope with hands that had stopped shaking weeks ago. When you'd already lost everything, your body stopped wasting energy on fear. She broke the seal and read words that felt like knives wrapped in silk. "Serafina, 3 months is sufficient time for reflection. I'm prepared to negotiate your family's release on the following terms. You will publicly acknowledge that your accusations against certain noble families were exaggerated or based on incomplete information. You will accept a formal pardon for the assault on crown property. You will agree to permanent residence at least 100 miles from the capital. In exchange, your family will be released with their fortunes and titles intact. This is a generous offer, considering the alternative is indefinite detention while we continue investigating their potential involvement in your activities. Think carefully. Your pride has already cost enough." Lucian. She read it twice, felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with temperature. He was offering everything she'd wanted 3 months ago. Her family's freedom, an end to their suffering. All it cost was admitting she'd been wrong, that her crusade had been exaggerated, that the corruption she'd exposed was just unfortunate misunderstandings by well-meaning nobles. All it cost was letting them rewrite history so that she became the villain who'd misinterpreted evidence and caused unnecessary chaos. So that workers would think maybe their suffering wasn't as bad as she'd claimed. So that the system could point to her as proof that accusations of systemic corruption were usually just personal vendettas. Catherine watched her face. "What will you do?" What would she do? Serafina looked at the letter and thought about her mother, who'd never understood politics, but had taught her that truth mattered more than comfort. Her brother, who'd begged her to stop before something terrible happened. Her family, who'd done nothing except be related to someone who'd refused to stay silent. They deserved freedom, deserved to live without being leveraged, deserved better than a daughter and sister whose principles had made them collateral damage. But what kind of freedom was it if she had to lie to purchase it? What kind of daughter was she if she taught her family that truth was negotiable when the cost got high enough? These were the questions that had no good answers, just choices about which betrayal you could live with, betraying the people you loved or betraying everything you'd fought for. "I need to think," she said finally. Catherine left. Serafina sat alone with Lucian's letter and felt the weight of 3 months of exile pressing down. She'd been so certain when she'd refused his first deal. So sure that calling his bluff and maintaining principles mattered more than compromise. But principles didn't keep her family safe, didn't undo their suffering, didn't accomplish anything except making her feel righteous while everyone else paid the price. Maybe Lucian had been right. Maybe some fights couldn't be won. Maybe the smart thing was accepting modified justice and incremental change. Maybe the truly brave thing wasn't fighting impossible battles,
but knowing when to surrender so that the people you loved could survive. She pulled out paper and began writing a response. The words came slowly, each one feeling like swallowing glass. Lucienne, I accept your terms. Draft the statement you want me to sign. My family's freedom is worth more than my pride. Her hand hesitated over the signature. This was it. The moment where she chose survival over everything she'd become, where she accepted that the powerful won not because they were right, but because they had the patience and resources to outlast resistance. Where she stopped being the crimson villainess and became just another woman who'd learned that the system always won in the end. The door opened. Catherine again, but this time she wasn't alone. Marcus stood behind her, leaning on a cane, his face scarred from the prison assault. And behind him, more faces. Cook, two of the stable hands who'd survived, others from the household who'd followed her into that disaster. My lady, Marcus said, we heard about the letter, about the offer. Serafina set down her pen. And we want you to know, whatever you decide, we understand. You've sacrificed enough. If you need to accept this deal to save your family, no one here will judge you for it. The kindness in his voice was almost worse than condemnation would have been. She could have handled anger, betrayal. But this compassionate understanding that she'd reached her limit, that felt like permission to give up, and she didn't know if she wanted permission or needed someone to tell her to keep fighting. I've already written my acceptance, she said quietly. Marcus nodded slowly. Then that's decided. He moved to the window, looking out at mountains that marked the edge of the kingdom's reach. Can I tell you something before you send it? If you must. My sister, the one who died in Rothmore's mine. Before she died, she sent me a letter. Said the work was brutal and the conditions were killing them, but she was glad to be earning money for our family. Said she understood that sometimes you had to accept suffering because the alternative was starvation. His voice caught. She died thinking that was just how the world worked. The powerful people got to decide who suffered, and the rest of us just had to be grateful it wasn't worse. Serafina closed her eyes. She knew where this was going. You changed that, Marcus continued. When you exposed Rothmore, when you documented what he'd been doing, my sister's death meant something. Wasn't just another worker lost to profit margins. It was evidence of a crime. Proof that the powerful could be held accountable. He turned to face her. If you recant that, if you say you exaggerated or misunderstood, then her death becomes meaningless again. Just an unfortunate accident in a system where accidents happen and no one's really responsible. The words hit like physical blows. Serafina opened her eyes and looked at the people who'd followed her through assassination attempts and royal betrayal and a suicide assault on a crown prison. They all wore the same expression. Not judgment, just waiting to see who she'd choose to be in this moment. The woman who saved her family. Or the woman who honored everyone who died believing change was possible. My family is being held hostage because of choices I made, she said. Because I couldn't let go of the need for perfect justice. How is that different from what I'm accusing the nobles of? Using people as collateral for my goals. Catherine spoke from the doorway. Because your goal was making sure workers like Marcus's sister weren't treated as disposable. The nobles' goal was profit and power. Intent matters, my lady. Or else there's no difference between the violence we use to free prisoners and the violence they use to imprison them. But my family wouldn't want you to betray everything you believe just to save them. Catherine moved into the room, her expression fierce in ways Serafina had never seen before their night of blood and fire. I've read your brother's letters, my lady, the ones he sent before he was taken. He was proud of you, scared, yes, but proud. Proud that his sister cared about something more than comfort, that she refused to stay quiet when staying quiet was safer. Serafina looked at the incomplete letter of surrender on her desk, looked at the faces of people who'd lost as much as she had, but hadn't given up on the belief that fighting mattered. Looked at her own reflection in the window glass and saw a stranger wearing her face, someone harder, colder, more dangerous than the gentle Duchess had ever been. But underneath that stranger was still the woman who'd driven a hatpin through an assassin's eye rather than die quietly. Who'd stood in an amphitheater and told thousands of people that justice mattered more than stability. Who'd walked into a prison knowing she'd probably die but refusing to let Lucien's betrayal be the end of her story. That woman wouldn't write this letter, wouldn't trade truth for temporary peace, wouldn't teach her family that principles were negotiable when the powerful applied enough pressure.
She picked up the unfinished letter and fed it to the fire. My lady? Catherine's voice held hope and fear in equal measure. I'm not signing it. Any of it. Serafina watched the paper curl and blacken. Lucian thinks he's won because my family is leverage and I love them too much to let them suffer. He's right about the love, wrong about what that love means. I don't understand. Neither do I. Not completely. But I know this. If I teach my family that truth can be abandoned when costs get high enough, I'm not saving them. I'm just showing them a different kind of prison. She turned from the fire. They're being held because I refuse to stay silent. If I recant now, I'm telling them their suffering was my fault for not being quiet. But it's not. It's Lucien's fault for holding them. It's the nobility's fault for being so corrupt that exposing them seemed necessary. It's the system's fault for making resistance so expensive that most people can't afford it. But they'll stay imprisoned until Lucien decides the cost of keeping them exceeds the benefit, which means I need to make that cost higher. Serafina moved to her desk where she'd been keeping documents hidden even from Catherine. He thinks I'm neutralized, that exile broke me. He's about to learn the difference between defeated and waiting. Marcus's scarred face broke into something that might have been a smile. What are you planning? War. The kind you fight with information instead of weapons. The kind where you make your enemy's victory so expensive they choose to negotiate rather than keep winning. She spread documents across the desk, evidence she'd been compiling for 3 months about Lucien's activities. The Crown Prince thinks he played this perfectly. Exposed some corruption to look reformist, then shut down the investigation before it destabilized too much. Kept my family as leverage. Exiled me as a warning. Everyone wins except the people who keep suffering. So we expose him? Catherine asked. We expose the system. His corruption isn't the dramatic kind. He's not embezzling or murdering. He's just maintaining a structure that benefits the powerful at everyone else's expense. That's harder to make people care about. But I've spent 3 months documenting how many workers have died in mines that weren't reformed. How many prisoners remain in facilities that weren't shut down? How many families still suffer under nobles who face no real consequences? She looked at her people. Numbers don't lie. We show the kingdom exactly what gradual reform means, continued suffering measured in bodies, while the powerful congratulate themselves for minor adjustments. Cook stepped forward, her face grim. And how do we distribute that information when we're all trapped in exile and the printing presses are controlled by nobles? Serafina pulled out the final document, a thick envelope sealed with wax. I've been writing to someone with resources and a grudge against the crown, someone who stands to benefit if Lucien's reputation is damaged. Who? Lord Adrian Blackthorne. The room went silent. Catherine's expression was horror and disbelief mixed. My lady, he's still my legal husband, technically, still in prison, still furious about being betrayed, and still connected to every noble family that wants to see Lucien fail. Serafina kept her voice steady, despite the nausea at what she was proposing. I offered him a deal. I provide evidence of Lucien's failures as a reformer. He uses his contacts to distribute it. In exchange, I publicly acknowledge that while his crimes were real, the investigation was compromised by political motivations. That's letting him off. That's using one corrupt power structure against another. Adrian stays in prison, but his reputation is partially rehabilitated. Lucien's reform campaign is exposed as performative. The nobility gets evidence that challenging corruption is just political theater. Everyone loses something. No one wins cleanly. Marcus shook his head slowly. That's not justice. No, it's survival. It's accepting that perfect justice doesn't exist and fighting for whatever imperfect version we can achieve. Serafina met each person's eyes. I'm not the hero of this story. I'm not even sure I'm not the villain. But I'm the woman standing in this room who refuses to let her family's suffering be used as leverage forever. This is the best move I have. Ugly, compromised, but maybe effective. And if it works? Catherine asked. If Lucien's forced to negotiate? Then I get my family back without lying about the corruption we exposed. The nobles we arrested stay punished, even if their punishments were lighter than deserved. And maybe, some workers see that resistance accomplished something, even if it didn't accomplish everything. Cook crossed her arms. And if it doesn't work? Then I'm the woman who made a deal with the man who betrayed her, accomplished nothing, and gets remembered as exactly the kind of vindictive villain they always said I was. Serafina's voice was steady. I'm willing to accept that outcome, because the alternative is teaching everyone watching that resistance always fails if you just wait long enough for the resistant to get tired. She pulled out fresh paper and began writing. Not surrender this time, instructions, names of contacts in the capital who could receive evidence, distribution networks among worker guilds that nobles didn't monitor, printing presses in provinces too far from the capital for easy control. She was building something that looked like the investigation she'd run with Lucian, but smaller, scrappier, funded by spite, and operated by people with nothing left to lose. It wouldn't topple the monarchy, wouldn't trigger revolution, but it might make continuing to hold her family more expensive than releasing them, might make Lucian choose negotiation over indefinite standoff, might change nothing except proving that even in exile, even defeated, she could still make the powerful uncomfortable. Over the next 6 weeks, the campaign unfolded like clockwork built from desperation. Documents appeared in markets documenting worker deaths in mines that were supposed to be reformed. Pamphlets circulated comparing Lucien's promises to actual conditions. Anonymous testimonies from families still suffering under nobles who'd faced minor consequences. Nothing directly accused Lucian of corruption. That would be too obvious, too easy to dismiss. Instead, the evidence just accumulated into a damning portrait of reform that was all performance and no substance, of a crown prince who'd talked about justice while ensuring nothing fundamentally changed. The nobility responded with predictable outrage, investigations into who was leaking information, arrests of printers and distributors. But the documents kept appearing because Serafina had learned from her first campaign. Don't centralize, don't rely on single distribution points. Make the network so dispersed that shutting it down required more resources than the powerful were willing to spend. She sat in her exile estate and watched reports flow in from Catherine's network. Watched the crown scramble to control information they couldn't fully suppress. Watched public opinion shift from relief that the investigation was over to questioning whether it had accomplished anything. And then, 8 weeks after she'd burned that letter of surrender, Lucien came to her. Not a letter this time. The man himself, traveling to her exile with minimal guard, arriving after dark like someone who didn't want witnesses. Catherine tried to bar him from entering, but Serafina waved her off. This confrontation had been inevitable from the moment she'd chosen fighting over surrender. He looked exhausted. Not physically, but in the way leaders got exhausted when events stopped following the script they'd written. When the woman you'd neutralized kept fighting from exile. When the victory you'd secured started looking less like victory and more like temporary ceasefire. They faced each other in her study. No weapons, no guards. Just two people who'd been allies and then enemies and now were something more complicated. You made a deal with Adrian, Lucian said without preamble. With the man who betrayed you, the criminal you exposed. Yes. That's hypocrisy. That's pragmatism. I learned it from watching you negotiate with nobles who should be executed but instead got comfortable exiles. She gestured for him to sit. He didn't. You came here for a reason. Say it. Your campaign is destabilizing everything I've spent months trying to rebuild. Workers are angry. Nobles are paranoid. My father is questioning whether I'm competent to manage reform. You're destroying the fragile peace I achieved. The fragile peace where my family stays imprisoned and nothing fundamentally changes? That peace? That peace where civil war was avoided and some corruption was addressed and the kingdom didn't collapse into chaos. His voice rose. You act like I'm the villain here, but I saved this kingdom from tearing itself apart. Your way would have led to bloodshed. My way led to bloodshed. Yours just made sure the blood belonged to people no one with power cared about. Serafina moved to pour wine she didn't want just to have something to do with her hands. You came here to make me stop. What's the offer this time? Lucien exhaled slowly. Your family, released, completely. No conditions, no surveillance. Their fortunes intact. You can visit them freely, stay in contact, ensure they're safe. In exchange for? Stop the campaign completely. No more documents, no more pamphlets, no more testimonies. Accept that the reforms I implemented are the best possible outcome given political realities. Serafina looked at him and saw a man who genuinely believed he'd done the right thing, who thought that avoiding civil war justified compromising on justice. who couldn't understand why she kept fighting when he'd already given her more than most resistance movements ever achieved. He wasn't evil, just limited, shaped by a system that taught him order mattered more than individual suffering. That gradualism was wisdom and immediate action was recklessness. She'd been shaped by different lessons, by being on the receiving end of betrayal and corruption, by learning that gradualism was easy to advocate when you weren't the one suffering while you waited for incremental change. "If I agree," she said slowly, "what happens to the workers still dying in unsafe mines? The families still trapped by corrupt debt schemes? The prisoners in facilities that were never actually reformed? They get helped, eventually, as I implement additional reforms when political conditions allow." Eventually, when conditions allow, she set down the wine glass. That's the promise every oppressive system makes. Wait. Be patient. Change takes time. Meanwhile, people keep suffering and dying and being told their pain is necessary for stability. And your alternative is what? Destabilize everything on the hope that something better emerges from chaos? That's not courage, Serafina. That's reckless disregard for everyone who'd die in the collapse. Maybe. Or maybe the real recklessness is maintaining systems that kill people slowly while congratulating yourself for not being violent. She met his eyes. "I'll stop the campaign, but not for your terms." "What are your terms?" "You release my family. You implement actual oversight on the mines and prisons, independent inspectors with power to shut down operations, not friendly nobles who rubber stamp approval. You create a formal appeals process for families who claim they're victims of noble corruption. And you publicly acknowledge that the initial investigation exposed real systemic problems, not just individual bad actors." Lucian shook his head. "That's impossible. The nobility would never accept that level of oversight. My father would remove me from succession for destabilizing noble power. Then I guess we're at an impasse, because those are my terms, real accountability, or I keep fighting." "You can't win. I've already contained most of your distribution networks. Within another month, I'll have shut down your campaign completely." "Probably, but that month means more documents circulating, more workers realizing the reforms were theater, more pressure on you to justify why nothing actually changed." Serafina smiled without warmth. "You said I can't win. You're right, but I can make you lose, make your victory so expensive that you wish you just negotiated fairly from the start." The silence stretched between them. Lucien's face cycled through calculation. The weighing of options, the recognition that she wasn't bluffing about being willing to fight until they destroyed each other. "Modified terms," he said finally. "I release your family. I implement oversight on new mining operations and create an appeals process with limited scope. I publicly acknowledge that systemic issues exist that require ongoing attention, but I don't give independent inspectors full shutdown authority. That's too much power to remove from noble oversight." It wasn't everything. Wasn't even most of what she wanted, but it was more than he'd been willing to offer before. More than most resistance movements ever achieved. Was that enough? Could she accept partial justice when she'd been fighting for complete accountability? She thought about Marcus's sister, about Catherine who'd been willing to die in that prison, about her family imprisoned because she'd refused earlier compromises. She thought about the difference between winning and surviving, about whether getting some justice was better than holding out for perfect justice that would never come. "I want it in writing," she said finally. "Formal royal decree. Not just promises. Documentation I can distribute if you backslide." Lucian nodded slowly. "Done. But Serafina, this is the last negotiation. If you restart your campaign after this, there won't be another deal. I'll prosecute your family for harboring a fugitive. I'll seize what's left of the Vale estates. I'll make sure you're not just exiled, but forgotten." "Understood." She extended her hand. "One last question." "What? Did you ever actually care about justice? Or was I always just useful until I became inconvenient?" Lucienne looked at her hand but didn't shake it. "I care about the kingdom, about preventing collapse, about making things moderately better without destroying stability. If that's not justice enough for you, I'm sorry. But it's all I can offer without causing more suffering than it prevents." He left without shaking her hand, left her standing in her study with the taste of compromise bitter on her tongue and the knowledge that she'd just accepted terms that meant some workers would keep dying in mines that should be shut down. Some families would keep suffering under nobles who faced insufficient consequences.
Some prisoners would remain in facilities that weren't adequately reformed. She'd failed to change everything, had maybe changed something. Time would tell which.
Catherine found her still standing there an hour later. "My lady, what did you decide?" "I chose my family, and I'll live with what that choice cost everyone else." Serafina's voice was steady, despite the guilt threatening to crush her. "Summon everyone. They deserve to know what I traded their sacrifice for." They gathered in the main hall, the people who'd followed her through revolution and betrayal and exile. Serafina told them everything: the deal with Lucien, the oversight that would be implemented, the appeals process that would exist, the public acknowledgement that systemic problems existed. She told them it wasn't enough, that it didn't justify the blood they'd shed or the lives that had been destroyed, that she'd chosen her family's freedom over continuing a fight that might have accomplished more if she'd been willing to let them remain hostages. She told them she'd understand if they hated her for it. Marcus spoke first. "My sister's death is officially documented as evidence of criminal negligence now. Duke Rothmore faced consequences even if they weren't severe enough. That's more justice than she would have gotten if you'd never fought. I can live with partial victory." Cook nodded. "My nephew works in one of those mines. If there's oversight now, even limited oversight, he's safer than he was before. That matters." One by one they spoke, not forgiving her exactly, just acknowledging that she'd done what she could with the power she had. That partial justice was better than no justice. That sometimes you had to accept compromise because the alternative was losing everything. Catherine spoke last. "You taught us that resistance was possible, that the powerful could be made uncomfortable, that we didn't have to accept suffering as inevitable." Her voice was firm. "The fight will continue, maybe not led by you, maybe not in ways that look like revolution, but you started something that doesn't end just because you negotiated peace." Serafina looked at these people who'd sacrificed everything to follow her and felt something crack in her chest. Not heartbreak, not even guilt. Something softer. The beginning of acceptance that she'd done her best in an impossible situation, that perfection wasn't achievable and partial victory was still victory, that maybe the real courage wasn't fighting forever but knowing when to accept that you'd pushed as far as you could and trusting others to continue the work. 3 days later, a royal carriage arrived at the estate. Serafina's family emerged, her mother, her brother, her aunt, and cousins. Thinner than she remembered, shadowed by months of captivity, but alive, free. Her mother embraced her without words. Her brother just held her and shook. They didn't ask about the deal she'd made, didn't need to. They could see it in her face, the cost of their freedom measured in compromises she'd swore she'd never make.
"I'm sorry," Serafina whispered. "I'm sorry it took so long. Sorry you suffered because of my choices." Her mother pulled back, studying her face. "You're different." "I know. Harder, colder." Her mother touched her cheek. "But not broken. I was afraid they'd break you." "They tried, but breaking and changing aren't the same thing." Serafina looked at her family, the people she'd been willing to compromise everything to save. "I need to know something. If I'd refused to negotiate, if I'd kept fighting and you'd stayed imprisoned indefinitely, would you have forgiven me?" Her brother answered. "We never blamed you. You were fighting for something important. We understood that even while we were scared. But would you have forgiven me if I'd chosen principle over your freedom?" Silence. Then her mother spoke with the gentle honesty that had defined her whole life. "I don't know. Maybe eventually, maybe never. But I'm glad we don't have to find out." That night, Serafina stood alone on the estate grounds and looked at stars that seemed closer here than they'd been in the capital. She thought about the woman she'd been before finding Adrian with Evelyn, thought about the Duchess who'd believed in love and loyalty and the inherent goodness of systems. That woman was truly dead now. Not murdered, just transformed by learning that the world was more complicated and cruel than she'd been taught. That power didn't respect gentleness. That justice required sacrifice. That sometimes you had to become monstrous to fight monsters. She'd become the crimson villainess. Not because she'd chosen evil, but because she'd refused to stay silent when silence was safer. Because she'd learned that the difference between hero and villain was often just perspective and who was writing history. The nobles called her villain because she'd threatened their power. The workers called her hero because she'd fought for accountability. The truth was she was neither.
just a woman who'd been broken and learned to weaponize the pieces. And now? Now she was something else. Not Duchess, not revolutionary, just Serafina Vale, a woman who'd lost almost everything fighting an unwinnable war and somehow found a way to survive the defeat. She thought about the oversight that would be implemented, the appeals process that would exist, the public acknowledgement that systemic problems required ongoing attention. It wasn't revolution, wasn't even comprehensive reform, but it was more than had existed before she'd refused to stay silent, more than would exist if she'd accepted the first deal Lucien offered. More than most people who challenge power ever achieved. Maybe that had to be enough. Maybe the real wisdom was accepting that you couldn't change everything, but you could change something. That partial victory was still victory. That the work would continue long after you were too tired to keep fighting. Catherine joined her outside, silent presence in the darkness. After a moment, she spoke. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Did she? Serafina thought about everyone she'd lost, everyone who'd suffered, every compromise she'd made, every principle she'd abandoned to survive. She thought about workers whose deaths were now documented, nobles who'd faced consequences they'd thought themselves immune to, common people who'd learned that resistance was possible even if victory wasn't guaranteed. She thought about this woman she'd become, harder, colder, more dangerous than the gentle Duchess had ever been, but also more honest, more aware of how power worked and how to fight it, more capable of surviving in a world that rewarded ruthlessness over kindness. "I regret the cost," she said finally. "I regret everyone who suffered because I couldn't find a better way. But I don't regret fighting. Don't regret refusing to stay silent. Don't regret becoming dangerous enough that the powerful had to negotiate instead of just eliminating me." What will you do now? Now. The question that defined what came after the war, after the compromises, after you'd burned yourself down to nothing and had to decide what to build from the ashes. Serafina looked at the estate that had been her Eleanor fortress, thought about her family slowly recovering from trauma, thought about the oversight systems that would need monitoring to ensure they actually functioned, thought about the work that would continue in small ways by people whose names history wouldn't remember. "I rebuild," she said, "not the kingdom, just this. A place where people who've been broken by power can learn to weaponize their pieces. Where workers know they have someone who'll document abuses. Where families trapped by corrupt nobles can find allies." She smiled without warmth. "The nobility wanted me neutralized. They got their wish. I'm not leading revolutions anymore, but that doesn't mean I'm silent. They'll come for you again eventually. Let them. I'm not the woman they destroyed. I'm what survived the destruction. And that's so much more dangerous than what I was before." Over the following months, the estate transformed. Workers who'd been victimized by noble corruption came seeking help. Families destroyed by illegal debt schemes found sanctuary. People who'd learned that the system was rigged but didn't know how to fight back discovered someone willing to teach them. Serafina didn't call it a resistance movement, didn't organize revolution, just created space where the vulnerable could become less vulnerable, where information about noble abuses could be documented, where the oversight systems Lucien had implemented could be monitored by people who actually cared whether they functioned. The nobility watched nervously. The crown maintained careful distance. Everyone understood that she'd been contained but not eliminated. That exile had just changed her tactics without breaking her will. She'd become something new, not Duchess, not revolutionary, something that existed in the space between cooperation and resistance. Someone who'd learned that you didn't have to win wars to make the powerful uncomfortable. You just had to refuse to lose completely. Letters arrived from the capital periodically, updates on the oversight implementations, reports on appeals that were being heard, documentation that the systems she'd fought for were functioning even if imperfectly. Catherine managed most of the correspondence. Marcus coordinated with worker guilds. Cook ran the household. Her family slowly healed from their captivity. And Serafina stood at the center of it all, watching the small changes accumulate into something that might eventually become significant. 1 year after her exile began, a letter arrived that was different from the others. Personal. From Crown Prince Lucien. "Serafina, the oversight systems are working, not perfectly, but workers' deaths in mines have decreased 17%. 3 nobles have been sanctioned for violations. The appeals process has heard 43 cases, ruling in favor of plaintiffs 19 times. I tell you this not to seek approval, but to acknowledge reality. Your fight accomplished something. Not everything you wanted, but something measurable, something real. I still believe you were reckless. Still think you risked too much for uncertain gains. But I'm beginning to understand that sometimes recklessness is the only response to systems designed to make careful change impossible. We'll never be allies again, probably never even friends. But I wanted you to know that the war you fought wasn't meaningless, even if you didn't win it the way you hoped. Lucienne. She read it twice, felt something shift in her chest that might have been vindication or might have been grief for everything that had been lost getting here. She didn't write back, didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. The oversight that was functioning, the appeals being heard, the workers who were slightly safer, the families that had somewhere to turn when nobles abused power. It wasn't revolution, wasn't even comprehensive reform, but it was more than nothing. And in a world where the powerful spent centuries perfecting the art of giving nothing, more than nothing was victory. Serafina stood at her window, watching sunset paint mountains in shades of fire, and thought about the woman she'd been. The gentle Duchess who'd believed love and loyalty were enough. Who'd thought that goodness would be rewarded and corruption would be punished and the universe had some inherent fairness. That woman was dead, mourned and buried and gone forever. What remained was someone harder, someone who understood that power respected nothing except the willingness to fight for it. Someone who'd learned that the only way to survive in a world designed to crush resistance was becoming uncrushed. The Crimson Villainess, the name they'd given her to make her monstrous. The identity she'd claimed and weaponized and used to force accountability from people who'd thought themselves immune. She'd never be the hero of this story. History would debate whether she'd been right or reckless, whether her methods justified her goals, whether the cost had been worth the partial victory. But she'd be remembered, not as the gentle Duchess who'd married for love and been betrayed, as the woman who'd refused to stay broken, who'd learned to fight back with whatever weapon she could forge from her own destruction, as the woman who'd proven that even the powerless could become dangerous if they were willing to pay the price. And that price, measured in blood and compromise and sacrifices that haunted her every night, had purchased something real, something measurable, something that would outlast her reputation and persist long after people forgot her name. She'd changed the kingdom, not completely, not perfectly, but enough that workers were slightly safer, enough that nobles were slightly more accountable, enough that resistance seemed possible to people who'd been taught it was futile. That would have to be enough, because it was all she'd achieved and more than she'd had any right to hope for. Serafina turned from the window and returned to work. There were letters to write, people to help, systems to monitor. The small daily labor of ensuring that the changes she'd fought for didn't get quietly reversed the moment attention shifted elsewhere. It wasn't glory, wasn't revolution, just maintenance work on small victories that might grow larger if enough people kept fighting. But that was what survival looked like after the war. Not triumph, not vindication, just the slow, patient work of protecting what you'd won and teaching others to keep fighting. She'd become something the kingdom had never seen before. Not a queen, not a martyr. Something in between, a woman who'd challenged power and survived the challenge and used that survival to prove that the system could be fought, even if it couldn't be destroyed. The Crimson Villainess. The name that was supposed to be condemnation, but had become something else. A warning, a promise, a reminder that the powerful only stayed powerful as long as the powerless accepted their powerlessness. And Serafina Vale would spend the rest of her life making sure no one forgot that lesson. Not through revolution, not through violence, just through the daily work of being someone the broken could turn to when the system tried to crush them again. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she'd first found Adrian with Evelyn, wasn't the justice she'd dreamed of when she'd started documenting corruption, but it was real, and it was hers, and it was enough, par.